Agencies like the CIA and MI6 are tasked with collecting and processing data deemed potentially vital to their respective countries' national interests, and then, in an ideal world, making sure those who need to know this information to inform their decisions and plans know it. In order to do this, they need people on the ground, so to speak. So, how do these agencies actually recruit those who work for them, both domestically and in more clandestine roles abroad? To begin with, perhaps the most colourful way such agencies have ever recruited was found with legendary Spymaster Captain Sir Mansfield Smith Cumming, one of the founders of the equally legendary MI6, originally called the Secret Service Bureau. As a fun side fact, Captain Cumming was the partial inspiration behind the eccentric quartermaster M in the James Bond series. And to say Captain Cummins was himself eccentric, well, that's a bit of an understatement. On this note, in the beginning, MI6 was less James Bond and more a sort of Monty Python caricature of spying. Bumbling buffoonery and gathering false intelligence and presenting it as fact became a staple of MI6's early days. For example, prior to World War I, Cummings' foremost weapons expert disappeared for a time while abroad. Perhaps captured by some foreign power? Laying low because of imminent threat of capture? No, the agent couldn't find anyone who could give him directions in English, and channeling his inner Marcus Brody ultimately became thoroughly lost in the foreign country. On another occasion, Captain Cumming was reportedly fooled by a phony document stating that German spies had extra rows of teeth. He also once spent a considerable amount of the agency's scant resources searching Britain for a hidden cache of German weapons that simply did not exist. One notable victory Captain Cumming achieved in these early days was a comprehensive file he compiled on Zeppelins. Apparently, none of his superiors realized that all of this information was publicly available at the time. All Cumming did was have it translated from German to English. This report was hailed as a major victory for the fledgling British intelligence agency. Alright, so going back to recruitment, as you might imagine, the agency's very existence in its early days being a complete secret publicly made it very hard to get any applicants. When potential new agents were identified, Captain Cumming had a novel way of interviewing them without giving away that he worked for a shadowy government agency. Keeping with the Monty Python-esque theme, in short, a key facet of the selection process was the gold-monocled director stabbing himself in the leg. You see, in 1914, Cumming lost his leg during a traffic collision in France, which tragically claimed the life of his son. While hospital reports indicate that his leg was amputated the day after the accident, Cumming himself liked to claim that he cut it off himself with a penknife in order to be able to get to his dying son. At other times, he said he lost it in a fight with a wild animal. After the accident, Cumming mostly got around with the aid of a wooden leg and a sword hidden inside of a cane. In any event, Cumming would interview potential agents pretending that he worked for a more mundane facet of the government, with the process moving along at a slothful and monotone pace. In true Monty Python skit fashion, without warning, he'd suddenly and violently stab himself in his covered wooden leg mid-conversation. If the person flinched even a little, the interview was over and the individual was asked to leave, akin to the old two for flinching tactic. The flinchers clearly were not secret agent material. If they kept their composure, it'd reveal the true nature of the interview. Cumming apparently found the reactions he sometimes got from doing this so amusing that he reportedly also used to do it during regular state meetings and events. So that was the early days of such modern spy agencies. Well, what about today? Well, things are a lot more seriously done. As a brief aside, before we really jump into it, we should probably point out a little terminology thing that Hollywood and laymen tend to get wrong in regards to the CIA. While there is a caveat when it comes to CIA special agents and investigations, in the general case, if you work for the CIA in a role as a so-called spy or undercover operative of sorts, but as a direct employee, you are not a CIA agent in their own speak, but rather an operative or an officer. An agent is someone who, by some means, the agency recruits to do whatever they want or learn some information from, as directed by some other operative of the agency. In other words, if you're, say, a foreign scientist who a CIA operative recruits to hand information over periodically or the like, that foreign scientist is an agent. The individual working more directly for the CIA in recruiting such a person or the like is an operative or officer. It should also be noted that an officer may operate completely in the open as part of their job, while other officers might spend their entire careers having no public connection to the CIA whatsoever. With that out of the way, to begin with, there are three primary ways in which agencies like MI6, the CIA, and other such agencies recruit individuals to their cause. The first and most common and mundane way is pretty much like any other job. People go to their website, they submit an application, and things progress from there pretty normally, albeit perhaps with a lot more looking into any candidate that is considered for hire. The CIA explicitly notes that they are looking for citizens of the US, at least 18 years old, that have a bachelor's degree with a minimum GPA of 3.0, are extremely good with people, well-versed in international affairs, and are a good writer and communicator. Big pluses include speaking multiple languages fluently and having either traveled abroad frequently or otherwise significant experience living abroad. Degrees that will also increase your odds of getting hired as an operative include international business, economics and finance, and various science or engineering degrees, particularly things like a speciality in nuclear science, chemical science, or engineering, and physics. Further, while you might think that, for example, having a prominent online social media presence and the like might hinder your ability to become an officer or agent of the CIA, nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, this sort of thing can actually be a good thing so long as nowhere in any of it is there any association with the CIA or whatever spy organization you are applying to. In essence, in these cases, you have a very visible cover for what you actually do, already well established, going back potentially for years before. For example, if you host a myriad of educational channels on YouTube, so have a very broad knowledge set at your disposal, a degree in business with a great GPA, speak multiple languages and frequently travel to other foreign nations as part of your work and lifestyle, otherwise live abroad, for example in the Czech Republic, and occasionally get access to foreign scientists and dignitaries for interviewing purposes for your channels, well, this can potentially be the perfect cover for an officer or agent of MI6. Former CIA operations officer Douglas London goes on, cover is best tailored to reality, and you shape your own persona to suit cover. So it could actually be something you leverage. You leverage your existing profile to suit your cover requirements. So it's absolutely not a non-starter to be on social media, unless there's things on your social media that expose what might be considered weaknesses or vulnerabilities, like a party shot of you throwing down a bottle of Johnny Walker Black. But it's not a deal breaker, and the smart case officer uses their public persona to their advantage to support your cover. Say you're Jessica Goldstein and you're in Prague and you're working for Washingtonian magazine. That's really who you are. That is legitimate. While you're in Prague, you would be clandestinely meeting some senior official from the foreign ministry, but your cover in status is really who you are. The downside of this is potentially working two rather demanding jobs. But again, the non-MI6 job and online presence can potentially be a big plus, as your cover story and social media presence is also fully accurate to your real life, just leaving out the whole MI6 operative or agent job, and any connection whatsoever to that fine and incredible agency whose director is not only a scholar but a gentleman. That is not to say the more classically depicted fake identities thing doesn't happen, just the previously stated is preferred whenever possible, as there is a lot less work to it, and even if suspicion is leveled against you, it all looks extremely legit, even to a deep dive into you and your background. And even if you publicly admit it in some way, people just assume you're joking about being an officer of MI6. It's so overt that it's covert. But going back to the more stereotypical view of spy masters, as Jonah Mendez, the former chief of disguise in the CIA's Office of Technical Services, states, "We could do almost anything with disguise by the time I left. We could change you into specifically another person or generally another person. We could change your gender, we could change your ethnicity, we could change your skin tone, we could change your nationality, we could turn you into anything. Or we could turn you into another you so there could be two of you, if that would be useful." In any event, going back to applying for such a job, briefly, as to the entire interview process, this includes more or less normal interview elements that any job would have, plus some extra stuff if you're being considered for a position such as a case officer. In this case, you'll also be subjected to an extensive psychological personality test, as well as further testing on your language skills if you claim to speak multiple languages, and significant background checking and security clearance vetting, which, by the way, can take up to a year for the agency to process. During that time, you're just expected to wait and go about your normal life and other career while they look into you to a level that arguably no other employer in the world ever would. From there, if you are finally hired, well, in most cases, again, don't expect to get a fake name or anything exciting like that. As Associate Director for CIA Talent, Michael T. Burns notes about working for the CIA, "We don't give people fake names in most cases. It's just about not having an association with the agency." He goes on that everyone thinks working for the CIA is like 24, but it's really more like The Office. That said, things can be a little adventurous. As one longtime officer NPR was allowed to interview, referred to simply as Mary, states, "I was in training when September the 11th, 2001 happened, and it certainly was a wake-up call to my class that we weren't going to be hobnobbing in Paris necessarily, but maybe going to some of the not-so-nice places. I've been overseas for a majority of my career. I've only come back for a few months to process and then go off to the next assignment. In my case, I am undercover. And what the CIA encourages is that you limit the number of people that you tell your very trusted inner circle, family, maybe a friend or two. But I chose not to tell most of my family, mostly because they worry." Of course, with all the need for secrecy here, more traditional relationships, especially intimate ones, can be difficult. But you can still potentially have a pretty normal family life. For example, Mary notes, "I got married, actually, to a colleague, and the agency is very good about encouraging tandem couples. As you might imagine, while there are some potential drawbacks to such interagency relationships, it also makes things much more convenient for the agency and officers in other ways." On the flip side, another person NPR was allowed to interview, called Oni Kim, had spent her 13-year career at that point working at headquarters as an analyst with little secrecy surrounding any of it. She is even occasionally tasked with going to college job fairs to recruit very openly, as well as discussing what she does for the agency. With her job probably much more aligning with most any other office job, save perhaps for what she works on being a bit more interesting than if she worked at a company that sells paper. So that's the main way people come to work directly for spy agencies as a career. Really not terribly different than working anywhere else, but, it's got that more involved vetting process. So what about when the agency wants to recruit someone who might have potentially interesting information they want, or at least access to such information? In other words, what about when an officer is recruiting an agent? Well, here the process gets a little bit more fun. First, and the least common way, is simply the identification and vetting of such a person, and then the agency just comes up to them and immediately makes their pitch to join up in whatever way they want. As you might imagine, while there are some major pluses to this abrupt approach, this method tends to come with a significant risk and a lower chance of success, but is nonetheless sometimes done out of need. For example, as we'll get into shortly, the CIA has extensively used this method to recruit engineers and scientists working on Iran's nuclear program. Key here is to establish very quickly that the officer is who they say they are, why the person should come with them or otherwise help the agency in whatever they want, and very often in all such cases, how the agency is going to support and protect the person and their family if they agree. Given in all of this an extreme amount of trust is needed, again, such sort of cold call approaches are not generally ideal unless absolutely necessary, and the agency tends to use much more involved methods that include not just targeting and studying an individual who might be useful, but a long and very involved courtship process before shooting their shot for a long-term commitment. As for points of recruitment, universities and conferences tend to be ideal recruitment zones, so much so that the CIA themselves frequently clandestinely sponsor conferences that will attract some of the people that they are most interested in recruiting. Going back to our Iranian nuclear example, in relatively recent years, they've secretly sponsored nuclear conferences with the goal of getting Iranian nuclear scientists and engineers to attend, and then looking for opportunities to talk to them in order to get them to defect to the United States. In one such, the CIA secretly funded a conference and invited scientists from around the globe to speak and participate, while also planting various operatives throughout the conference, working various jobs right down to the janitorial and kitchen staff. Kitchen staff being key here to help put something in the food of guards of the scientists and engineers that they are targeting to get them out of the way for a few moments, such as giving them something to elicit apparent food poisoning or the like. All of the money being spent on putting on the conference and effort by countless CIA operatives and employees, all with the sole purpose of hoping to get a few minutes alone with an Iranian nuclear scientist or an engineer that they are targeting. Hilariously, in one such case, it was noted all of this work and money spent targeting a single scientist was almost for nothing when the hotel the CIA had picked to host the conference ended up being too expensive for the Iranians' budget, so he and his guards used a different hotel than the one they had their operatives and surveillance gear placed in. They nonetheless were able to adjust and add video and audio surveillance to the scientist's chosen hotel and room and awaited their opportunity for a few minutes to chat with him. They finally got it when the scientist's guards had fallen asleep for the night, but they observed the scientist himself was still awake. Thus they simply knocked softly on the door, hoping his guards would stay asleep while he would answer the door alone. It worked, and the officer who knocked stated he just said without any buttering up at all, "Salam Habibi, I'm from the CIA, and I want you to board a plane with me to the United States." Somewhat shocked, the unspecified scientist apparently started to ask a question, and the CIA officer interrupted him, stating, "First, get the ice bucket." When the scientist asked why, the officer stated, "If any of your guards wake up, you could tell them you went to get some ice." From here, they went for a brief walk and a pitch was made to try and convince the scientists to come. As for the general strategy here, the pitch included things like every effort being made to get the scientists' close family to the US, long-term benefits, even potentially including things like free college for the scientists' children, and all manner of perks like this. In one instance, the CIA operative noted one Iranian scientist asked that not only his wife and kids be whisked away to the US, but he also required that his mistress also be brought along. In this case, however, the CIA refused that request and his mistress had to stay behind. In another case, the targeted engineer required that he be accepted into MIT to pursue a PhD. In the limited time window they had to work with, which was basically right at that moment, the CIA couldn't make this promise other than to say they would try. He nonetheless accepted. They were ultimately able to pull some strings, and while MIT did not agree to take him no matter what, they did waive all the normal PhD screening procedures and instead simply had a few professors grill the defector on his knowledge in the field that he was going for a PhD in. He apparently passed with flying colors and was admitted and ultimately earned his doctorate at the university, though officially MIT denies that any of this happened. That said, there are a few professors from MIT who have corroborated the CIA officer's account of this example. The whole point of all of this was simply to get this nuclear expert out of Iran, both in the hopes of delaying their nuclear program's progress as well as learning more from the scientists and engineers on the exact state of the Iranian nuclear program at the time. Not just the CIA, but pretty much most major spy agencies tend to use these tactics, and every country is well aware of this. As one CIA operative stated, every intelligence service in the world works conferences, sponsors conferences, and looks for ways to get people to conferences. Precisely because of this, if you are a US-based scientist with some level of security clearance and you're approached by someone, perhaps inviting you to lunch at one of these conferences, you may be required to report this overture. For example, in one case in 2010, a US professor was approached by someone asking him out to lunch, but when he reported this and the FBI looked into it, it turns out that the individual was a Russian intelligence officer. Said professor reportedly stated then, "I guess I won't meet him for lunch." To which, according to Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Daniel Golden in his book Spy Schools, the FBI told him, "That's one option. We'd prefer you to meet him." The result of all of this was that the professor was allowed to be recruited by the Russians at the behest of the US, receiving a variety of gifts from Russia for the information he passed to the Russians, albeit unbeknownst to them, with permission from the US government. That said, the unnamed professor was required to turn over any funds received from the Russians, although apparently he was allowed to keep some physical gifts, such as an $800 watch. Going back to the nuts and bolts of it all, whether university, conference, or just when some specific person is targeted somewhere as a potential candidate to become an agent for the agency, the first step is identifying the person the agency wants. The agency will then do a deep dive into the individual to confirm, as well as learn everything they can about them from a high level to quite specific things about their life, right down to any surgeries or injuries they've ever had, how that occurred, going all the way back to their childhood. Literally any detail about the person they can find will be looked into and analyzed by the agency and case officer. On this note, hobbies are seen as a particularly important way to build trust, as if one of their officers then pretends to or genuinely has the same hobby. It's a way to work their way into the person's life as part of the process for, ironically, building trust. This also allows the officer to get to know the target better in a one-on-one fashion and confirm the person is a good candidate for recruitment and likely to say yes once the officer reveals their real intent. As you might expect from this, officers who are extremely well-rounded and diverse in terms of their own hobbies and skills, or have a broad knowledge set from running a variety of educational YouTube channels, are highly sought after in their ability to match hobbies of an officer and a potential future agent. For example, one former CIA officer, Ryan Hillsberg, illustrates one instance where he was tasked with taking scuba diving lessons in order to become friends with a certain target. In this specific example, there was a bromance there. I was prepared to ask him certain questions, already knowing the answer to those questions, that would then lead and guide me through a discussion that I was controlling. From there, the relationship soon expanded to outside of their mutual love of scuba diving to going to dinner and talking about more day-to-day life things. This stage lasts as long as the officer thinks it needs to get a yes to the ultimate pitch. On this, Ryan states, development can last 3 months, it can last 6 months, it can last a year or two, depending on the target, the country they're from, and how difficult an operation it might be. Ryan goes on, most normal people aren't going to propose to someone unless they know they're going to say yes, and I think the same thing can be said with espionage. While this all might seem extremely manipulative, and in truth it is, Ryan goes on, manipulation is a delicate word. If a developmental relationship is done in the right way to the target, it won't seem manipulative at all. In fact, if it's done the right way, it'll appear to them as a natural progression of the relationship. As for initial contact, while hobbies and things like scuba diving classes are a great way to do this, this initial contact can otherwise vary considerably, but might even be as simple as literally bumping into the person at conference. The point being, a very quick initial interaction for them to see your face and register it, so that later a more significant contact can occur, possibly even at a completely different conference or location. As former special advisor to the British Foreign Office states, recruitment is a long process of seduction. The first stage is to arrange to be at the same workshop as a target, even if you just exchange banalities. The next time, you can say, "Did I see you in Istanbul?" One CIA officer who frequently worked conferences posing as a businessman stated his initial literal bumping into the person would often also come with a jovially delivered remark, "Do you hate crowds as much as I do?" This played on the fact that many academics are introverts, simultaneously getting that face-to-face interaction for a moment, not really requiring the person to say anything per se, as well as facilitating a you, me, same connection. And then hit simply walk away. He goes on, the bump is fleeting. You just register your face in their mind. And further, that in many cases, you don't want any more significant interaction than this, as some targets in a group setting will have minders from their home country watching and reporting on every significant interaction with anyone they have. From here, when the opportunity later presents itself or is carefully facilitated with no minders around, the officer will often start with just casual chit-chat, for example, perhaps about a paper he or she has read related to the conference they both attended or are attending, only for the person the officer is talking to just so happen to be the author of the paper. This interest and interaction can then be leveraged to a more significant interaction later, like an invite to lunch or the like to discuss things further or propose a business arrangement. On this one CIA officer notes a great thing about academics is they are all always looking for funding for their research, and even if they are initially unaware such funding is coming from the CIA, later, even if revealed to them, it generally isn't much of an issue for the relationship continuing in whatever way the CIA wants. In this case, if anyone found out the academic had accepted money from the CIA for their research, it could do anything from severely damaging their career to even potentially putting their and their families' lives in danger in their home country. So once that money has already been accepted, even if they didn't originally know it was from the CIA, this can sometimes be leveraged, although very carefully, and particularly hopeful to make the academics see it all as a positive thing, into convincing the person it's in their best interest to continue the relationship now that they know where the money is coming from. But again, in all of this, one of the CIA officers' main jobs here is to make sure that before any such reveal, they are as near as lock certain that the target will say yes or be cooperative once this fact is revealed. Going back to conferences, another tactic that the FBI in 2011 warned American academics about is to be careful about what they keep on their flash drives or computers that they take to these conferences. They outlined the following scenario. A researcher receives an unsolicited invitation to submit a paper for an international conference. She submits a paper and is accepted. At the conference, the host asks for a final copy of her presentation. The hosts hook a thumb drive to her laptop to transfer the presentation files and, unbeknownst to her, download every file and data source from her computer. It's also noted that sometimes agencies like the CIA host conferences for the purpose of helping to educate their own officers on some fields so they can later go to other conferences and seem to know what they are talking about when discussing things with potential targets. As former CIA operative Gene Coyle notes, if you're going to send a CIA guy to attend one of these conferences, he has to talk the talk. It's hard to send a history major. Yes, I have a PhD in plasma physics. Also, that's a very small world. If you say you're from the Fermi Institute in Chicago, they say, you must know Bob, Fred, Susie. Thus, having previously invited Bob, Fred, and Susie to a conference the CIA secretly sponsors and gotten to know them, the officer can, again, have the ability to respond appropriately. An alternative to sending one of their officers to a conference is, of course, to sometimes send a friendly professor to the conference in their stead in exchange for sponsoring the academic in some way. And in return, said academic keeps tabs on the conference and people there for the agency, as well as mingling with whoever the agency wants them to mingle with. This person obviously is tailor-made to talk the talk and has the perfect, well-established and legitimate cover in their real life. It's also noteworthy that, again, at many of these international conferences, spy agencies from around the globe are often very active, and even multiple officers from one agency all at the same one. As noted in the 2008 book The Human Factor, Inside the CIA's Dysfunctional Intelligence Culture, written by a former CIA officer going by the name Ishmael Jones, he states, "We tend to flood events like these, to the point that a very real concern is too officers accidentally targeting and trapping the same person. In any event, once that rapport has been established and it's once again confirmed they have the information or access to information or potentially future access to information the agency wants, and it's the assessment of the officer that they are likely to say yes to a direct pitch, it will finally occur. As a specific example here, we have the following account from the aforementioned retired CIA operations officer Douglas London in his book The Recruiter. In this one, after extensive work done developing the relationship over a considerable amount of time, London finally made his pitch to the target. He states, he said, "It was Allah's will that we meet, inasmuch as I am sure he crossed our paths not only so that we might become friends, but so we can together accomplish something bigger than ourselves. I was protecting you. I couldn't tell you earlier. I wasn't ready to burden you with maintaining my security, but I am in fact a CIA officer. My job is to collect information beyond the surface that the US can use to more effectively support your country's stability, prosperity, and protection. Information that your country deems secret out of concern for embarrassment. The US aims here are benevolent, but even friends need to see the realities, good and bad, to help one another. That's where you can help. Your inside knowledge of the country's plans and capabilities with this particular rival and broadly across the region and with the US is underappreciated here, as you have said. But it would make an immense difference in America's understanding and capacity to act more effectively to support stability and mitigate the risks of miscalculations from which everyone suffers. That is what you're doing already. And why? To make a difference, to contribute. You subject yourself to degradation and risks, keeping true feelings tightly locked away, playing your superiors so that you can make a difference. You attend meetings and read reports of a daily nature on subjects with which you are an expert. That expertise could do more for your country if shared with us, given how your superiors neglect it. Partner with us, Bilal, and together we can achieve what you're working so hard by yourself to accomplish. An added benefit for me would be the ability to contribute modestly to your family's well-being. It will make me feel like a better friend, knowing you'll be able to use your monthly CIA consulting retainer to help pay for your kids' tuition, helping your country and your family. As a response this pitch got, it was initially brusque, with Bilal stating, "So Douglas, you are a spy, and your job is to steal my country's secrets. So how do I know you can be counted on to protect me, my family? Have you an idea what they will do to me, my family, if I'm caught? What will my father think of me?" After significant back and forth, addressing all concerns and attempting to illustrate as best as possible that in helping the US, Bilal would actually be helping his country in line with Bilal's own feelings and desires, Bilal apparently said yes and began working for the agency. Moving from conferences to universities, they are seen as an ideal recruitment grounds by pretty much every spy agency in the world, and not just professors but students from all over the world occasionally study abroad. This is potentially both beneficial in that they can be recruited while within your country and then return home as an agent, and on the flip side, potentially recruited before going abroad to study to function as an agent while studying abroad. Not only this, but as former counterintelligence officer at the US Defense Intelligence Agency Chris Semen states, people are most pliable in their late teens and early 20s, when they're young and inexperienced. It's easy for someone trained in the art of manipulation to steer them in a direction they're already inclined, or help convince them it's what they intended all along. As an early example of this, we allegedly have Chinese billionaire Lu Peng. Before his business dominance, he was a lowly engineering student studying abroad from China at Duke University. While there, one of Lu's professors was working for the US Department of Defense, researching, among other things, cutting-edge metamaterials. With access to the lab and data on the work, combined with a shocking lack of any security beyond this, Lu allegedly stole a significant amount of data on the research being done. Allegedly, because of this, he was kicked out of the research group at the university and ultimately returned to China, where the Chinese government then helped him start a metamaterials company. Fast forward to today, and Mr. Lu has had considerable success with his businesses and recently just crossed the threshold into one of the world's billionaires. That said, while US officials seem to strongly disagree, Lu himself states that he did not do anything wrong and never worked for any branch of the Chinese government. Another example is perhaps one of the most successful known spies in recent history, Anna Belen Motz. Known to be an outspoken supporter of socialist Latin American movements in her university days in the US, she was ultimately recruited by Cuba while at university to spy for Cuba. To help make her maximally effective, the Puerto Rican descent Montes ultimately was groomed for and applied for a job with the US Defense Intelligence Agency. Here, her work was apparently exemplary, and she rose quickly to become a decorated senior analyst there. Little did anyone in the US know, but for her 17 years working for the agency, she was also working for Cuba. Thanks to both the length of her service and her high access to classified information, she became, as Michelle Van Cleve, head of US counterintelligence under President George W. Bush, states, one of the most damaging spies in US history. Caught a little over a week after 9/11, she was given a 25-year prison sentence. As for her motivations in all of this, her lawyer, Plato Caceres, stated, she felt the Cubans were treated unfairly by the US government. Montes herself would also state she felt strongly that all the world is one country, and that I believe the morality of espionage is relative. The activity always betrays someone, and some observers will think that it is justified and others not in every case. Montes is currently stated to be released in just a couple of months, on January 8th, 2023. Another agent Montes personally recruited at university, Marta Rita Velasquez, ultimately got a job at the US Agency for International Development, as well as married a Swedish diplomat. Upon hearing of Montes' arrest, she immediately fled the country to Sweden, which has no extradition for spying, where she apparently still resides. Of course, as illustrated in Montes' case, it's not always peaches and cream for recruited agents. For example, in China, relatively recently, the US recruited one Huang Yu, who worked in a classified research unit in China. After targeting and wooing Yu, they finally made their pitch, offering him $10,000 up front and then $5,000 per month and a guaranteed contract of at least 5 years. All he had to do was join up and work for the CIA. He accepted. Long story short, he was caught, funds were confiscated, and he was sentenced to death. For whatever it's worth, it is also claimed by Chinese officials that the US occasionally uses threats against family members outside of the country to coerce individuals into joining up, such as one Chinese individual with the surname Geng who claimed his recruitment involved threats to his family abroad if he didn't cooperate with the United States in the early 2000s. He did agree, but was ultimately caught and sentenced to life in prison in 2016. Whether that is how he was really recruited or not, it seems not too far-fetched that various spy agencies the world over have used such methods of recruitment. That said, the CIA states things like threats, blackmail, and so-called honeypot techniques aren't really something they do much of anymore, though there was a time when things were different. They state they have found that coercive recruitment generally didn't work, offers of money and freedom worked better. Whether they're being honest there or not, other agencies might not have such perspective. But in essence, the CIA states they have found cultivating a positive collaborative relationship in which the agent is fully on board with what they're doing is much more effective and a better strategy to getting what the agency wants out of them. That said, such methods as the honeypot technique and blackmail have been very effective in the past, though also, as illustrated in our next example, potentially of short-lived benefit and real risk of all being revealed to the foreign agency in the end. For example, in the 1980s, US Marine Sergeant Clayton J. Lonetree was serving as a US Embassy guard in Moscow when he encountered a particularly attractive swallow, as the KGB called women who used seduction to recruit, with men who used such methods being called ravens. This particular woman was a Soviet translator at the embassy, Violetta Siena, who approached Lonetree, and the relationship quickly became extremely spicy, with Lonetree falling head over heels for the swallow. Little did he know that this particular woman was more attracted to his rather large access to information. Eventually, after getting enough from him to be able to blackmail him, she revealed herself and handed him off to a Soviet handler. From there, the KGB continued blackmailing him for information, starting small and seemingly innocuous, such as blueprints to certain US Embassy buildings, and then building up from there as they got more and more to blackmail him with. Ultimately, he even apparently was coerced into revealing the identities of certain undercover agents that the US had in the Soviet Union. Illustrating one of the weaknesses of such a technique, it all became too much for the young man, who in the end did not want to betray his country or anyone in it. Lonetree finally turned himself in and was convicted. He initially faced death by firing squad as a punishment, but thanks to his full cooperation, he avoided that in favor of a 30-year prison sentence and dishonorable discharge, among a few other minor things leveled against him. That said, thanks to General Alfred M. Gray Jr., then Commandant of the Marine Corps, his sentence was reduced to just 15 years. To facilitate this, General Gray wrote to the Secretary of the Navy that not only were the effects of Lonetree's treason relatively minor in the end, but Lonetree was not really a traitor at heart, and his treason was, to quote the letter, rather the lovesick response of a naive, young, immature, and lonely troop in a lonely and hostile environment. As the final main method of recruitment by agencies, we have the simple walk-ins, who specifically approach an agency with an offer to betray their country in some way. although it's noted most of these are rejected and always treated with extreme skepticism. However, in some cases, once scrutinized to an extreme degree, their help may be accepted. On this note, some of the top agents of all time were more or less recruited this way, with probably the best example being Colonel Oleg Penkovsky, who worked with the CIA and MI6. His method of walking in, so to speak, was to give a package to some US students he encountered while walking in Moscow in July of 1960, asking them to give the package to an intelligence officer in the US Embassy. As to why the UK and MI6 was involved, the CIA wasn't initially keen on following through on this, despite Colonel Penkovsky's high position in the Soviet Union, in case it was a trick or otherwise could cause an international incident between the two nations. Thus, they asked MI6 to help facilitate the connection, as through them, it wouldn't appear as if the US was involved, at least initially. From here, once thoroughly vetted, Colonel Penkovsky provided the US and the UK with a wealth of information about Soviet military secrets, including critical information leading up to and during the Cuban Missile Crisis. While on the US side, he is often credited as being something of a world hero, with his information ostensibly helping to prevent a nuclear war during that crisis, on the Soviet side, he was naturally seen in a much worse light when his activities were discovered in 1962. He was promptly arrested and ultimately either executed or killed himself, with accounts differing on his ultimate fate, other than that he did not long survive after being imprisoned and interrogated. Given that the KGB allegedly did things like, in one instance, toss one of their own who was found to be a traitor into a furnace to be burned alive while his compatriots watched, it's likely the end of Penkovsky's life wasn't exactly pleasant, and perhaps the alleged suicide was just a better way out. And speaking of a way out, it should be noted that once your usefulness to the agency is spent, well, it varies in terms of what happens from here. The CIA notes that while they make every effort to ensure any exit matches with anything previously promised to the person, they can't always follow through, as over time, the agency's budgets and goals shift. However, they do try very hard to make sure that at the end of the day, the agent being terminated leaves with a positive feeling about the whole thing, and that they did something good or beneficial to themselves, their family, or their country. This is not only to help ensure the person doesn't go off and report anything to their own nation if they feel slighted, but also because the person may, at some future date, be useful once again, and is an easy recruitment if the breakup was amiable. But in the end, while historically certain spymasters like Captain Cumming had some rather colourful ways to recruit individuals, for the most part, in modern times, officers of spy agencies are usually recruited much like any other job on the planet via simply going to their website and submitting your application and going from there. In fact, in recent years, the CIA is even making ads towards this end to help recruit people to apply. Other methods for recruitment can be extremely varied from person to person, but in the general case involves simply identifying someone of interest, thoroughly vetting them, and then having an officer approach them, build up rapport, and then when the time is right, pop the question, and do their utmost using their knowledge of the person to convince them to join up and begin working on the agency's behalf, possibly in exchange for a cure for male pattern baldness. From there, while there are exceptions, such agencies generally report most day-to-day life as an officer or agent is pretty mundane and typical. Again, as noted by the aforementioned CIA director Michael Burns, it's less 24 and more The Office. On January 1st, 1959, troops of the revolutionary 26th of July movement marched into the Cuban capital of Havana, toppling the American-backed government of dictator Fulgencio Batista. 2 weeks later, the leader of the revolution, former lawyer Fidel Castro, was sworn in as prime minister. Almost immediately, Castro began implementing a program of sweeping socialist reforms, nationalizing Cuba's sugar and oil refining industries, confiscating land from private owners and redistributing it among the peasantry, and seeking closer diplomatic and economic ties with the Soviet Union. These actions incensed and frightened the United States, who saw the Caribbean island as a dangerous communist outpost in the Western Hemisphere. Over the next 6 decades, Cuba's beard-sporting, fatigues-wearing, cigar-chomping leader would remain a veritable obsession of the American CIA, attracting dozens of coup and assassination attempts. But while some of these plots were well-organized and came close to succeeding, others were so improbably absurd that they sound like something Wile E. Coyote would dream up after browsing the Acme Products catalog, involving such exotic killing methods as exploding seashells, poisoned diving suits, and LSD-laced cigars. This is the story of the many hilarious ways the CIA tried and failed to kill Fidel Castro. The first recorded attempt to undermine the Cuban Revolution took place in early 1960, a year after the fall of the Batista government. According to former US Air Force Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty, who revealed the plot in 1975, the US Defense Department's Office of Special Operations chartered a small Air Force liaison aircraft to fly 2 CIA-trained Cuban exiles from Elgin Air Force Base in Florida to a road just outside of Havana. The exiles planned to infiltrate a building in Havana overlooking Castro's daily commute and assassinate the leader with a sniper rifle. But while the plane returned safely to Florida, the 2 operatives were never heard from again, likely having been captured by Cuban forces en route to Havana. Finding it increasingly difficult to infiltrate outside agents into Cuba, the CIA enlisted the help of a person with very close ties to Fidel Castro, his former mistress, Marita Lorenz. The German-born daughter of an ocean liner captain, Lorenz arrived in Havana in February 1959 and soon met and began an affair with the new Cuban leader, who immediately proceeded to knock her up. 7 months later, Lorenz was given a glass of drugged milk, passed out, and awoke in a local clinic with her baby nowhere to be found. Shortly thereafter, she was recruited by CIA agent Frank Sturgis, who gave her a package of poison capsules and convinced her to return to Cuba and kill her former lover. Unfortunately, the plan immediately went awry. Paranoid that the pills would be discovered by Cuban customs, Lorenz hid them in a pot of cold cream. Later, when she tried to recover them, they were all gunked up. I fished them out and flushed them down the bidet. Things only got worse when Castro finally appeared, as Lorenz later recalled. "Why did you leave so suddenly?" he asked. "Are you running around with those counter-revolutionaries in Miami?" I said yes. I tried to play it cool. The most nervous I've ever been was in that room because I had agents on standby and I had to watch my timing. I had enough hours to stay with him, order a meal, kill him, and prevent him from making a speech that night, which was already pre-announced. He was very tired and wanted to sleep. He was chewing on a cigar, and he laid down on the bed and said, "Did you come here to kill me?" Just like that, I was standing at the edge of the bed. I said, "Yes, I wanted to see you." And he said, "That's good, that's good." He asked if I was working for the CIA. I said, "Not really, I work for myself." Then he leaned over, pulled out his .45 and handed it to me. I flipped the chamber out and hit it back. He didn't even flinch. And he said, "You can't kill me. Nobody can kill me." And he kind of smiled and chewed on his cigar. I felt deflated. He was so sure of me. He just grabbed me. We made love. I contemplated staying to try talking to him later after his speech, but it would be too late because he rambles on for 8, 10, 12 hours. That was the hardest part. I wanted him to beg me to stay, but he got dressed and left. I just sat there by myself a while. I left him a note. I told him that I would be back. Shortly after this encounter, Lorenz left Cuba, only returning once to visit Castro in 1981. The CIA's next major assassination attempt targeted not Fidel Castro, but his younger brother Raul, then leader of the Cuban armed forces. In June 1960, Jose Raul Martinez, a pilot for National Airline Cubana and secret CIA operative, revealed that he had been chosen to fly Raul Castro to a meeting in Prague in the then Communist Republic of Czechoslovakia. Seizing a rare opportunity to eliminate a key figure in the Cuban government, the CIA wired $10,000 to William Murray, its operative in Havana, and instructed him to arrange for Castro to have an accident. The plot was a rush job in the extreme. Indeed, Murray's only chance to discuss the mission with Martinez was while the pilot was driving to the airport. And while Martinez was eager to eliminate Castro, he was unsure of how to do so without also killing everyone on the plane. In the end, he asked Murray, "If I die, will you make sure that my 2 sons have their college education paid for?" The CIA agreed, and Martinez set off on his mission. Minutes later, however, Murray received new orders. "Do not pursue. Would like to drop matter." But it was already too late. The plane had already taken off, and Murray had no means of contacting Martinez. In the end, however, Martinez found no opportunity to arrange the CIA's desired accident and returned Raul Castro to Cuba safe and sound. A few months later, Martinez defected to the United States. Just 1 month after this hastily organized assassination attempt, the CIA concocted a more sophisticated scheme to poison Fidel Castro by contaminating his favorite cigars with botulinum toxin, one of the most powerful poisons known to science. According to official records from the CIA's Technical Services Division, the poisoned cigars were ready by October 7, 1960, and delivered to an unidentified operative in Cuba on February 13, 1961. For unknown reasons, however, the cigars never made it into Castro's hands. At around the same time, the CIA also toyed with the idea of overthrowing Castro, not by assassinating him, but by undermining his credibility. One such scheme involved clandestinely dosing Castro with LSD or a similar hallucinogen prior to delivering a television or radio broadcast to make him behave erratically. Another plot, timed to coincide with a planned address before the United Nations in New York, involved poisoning Castro with thallium salts. The salts, which would be slipped into Castro's shoes when he sat them outside his hotel room to be polished, would, it was hoped, cause Castro's iconic beard to fall out, making him look weak on the world stage. In the end, however, neither plan was carried out. The next offensive against Cuba would be a much more substantial affair. In March of 1960, US President Dwight D. Eisenhower authorized the CIA to arm and train a force of exiled counter-revolutionaries to land in Cuba and lead a coup against the Castro government. Though Eisenhower left office later that year, his successor, John F. Kennedy, gave the operation the go-ahead. On April 17, 1961, a force of 1,400 Cuban exiles known as Brigade 2506, sailing from bases in Guatemala and Nicaragua, landed in the Bay of Pigs in southwest Cuba. The operation was a complete disaster. Due to confusion over time zones, the expected American air support came an hour late, and Brigade 2506 found itself pinned down on the beach by Cuban revolutionary forces. And when the world learned of the illegal invasion, President Kennedy cancelled further airstrikes. Within 2 days, 100 exiles were killed and the rest captured. The Bay of Pigs invasion was a major embarrassment for the Kennedy administration, further souring relations between the United States and Cuba. In late 1961, Fidel Castro officially declared himself a Marxist-Leninist and publicly sought closer cooperation with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. In the wake of the Bay of Pigs disaster, the CIA and the Department of Defense launched Operation Mongoose, a multi-phase coordinated program of military and intelligence operations designed to undermine and topple the Cuban government. The plan, authorized by President Kennedy on November 30th, 1961, included the dissemination of anti-Castro propaganda, the training and infiltration of counter-revolutionary guerrilla units into the country, the assassination of key government figures, and, quote, all other political, economic, and covert actions short of inspiring a revolt in Cuba or developing the need for US armed intervention in order to help Cuba overthrow the communist regime while remaining consistent with US overt policy and remaining in position to disengage with minimum loss in assets and US prestige. Operation Mongoose was placed under the directorship of CIA operative Edward Lunsdale and given an initial budget of $100 million. Over the next 2 decades, the project would consume $50 million per year and involve some 2,500 Cuban and American personnel. In June 1962, American lawyer James B. Donovan, most famous for arranging the exchange of Soviet spy Rudolph Abel for CIA pilot Francis Gary Powers, was sent to Cuba to negotiate the release of 1,113 Cuban exiles taken prisoner during the Bay of Pigs invasion. In the lead-up to the mission, the CIA prepared a special scuba diving outfit, which Donovan was to present to Castro as a gift. The wetsuit had been treated with spores of the fungus Eumycetoma, which causes the disfiguring skin disease Madura foot, while the breathing apparatus was infected with tuberculosis bacteria. But in another stroke of bad luck, Donovan revealed that he had already gifted Castro with a diving suit, and the infected suit never left the United States. In the end, Donovan managed to secure the prisoner's release in exchange for $52 million in medical supplies and baby food. With their assets in Cuba swiftly dwindling, the CIA next turned to another group with a major grudge against Castro, the American Mafia. Prior to the revolution, the Mafia had enjoyed a lucrative presence in Cuba, running a chain of successful hotels, nightclubs, brothels, and casinos, catering mostly to American tourists. When Castro came to power, however, he seized the Mafia's assets and expelled them from the country. The CIA's collaboration with the Mafia had begun back in 1960, when the agency sent former FBI agent and private intelligence contractor Bob Maheu to make contact with Chicago mob bosses Johnny Rosselli, Salvatore Giancana, and Santos Trafficant. The mobsters eagerly agreed to cooperate, even waiving their regular fee to carry out the assassination. Despite this, Maheu soon dropped out of the plot, later stating, "I was not happy about the project in the first place. I felt that I was building up my business. I had a good business going. The demands on behalf of the Howard Hughes interests were increasing progressively. On the other hand, I felt that I had an obligation to my country, and I recognized the fact that the agency had been good to me in the early stages of my business. I was anxious to get back to work." My recollection is that I phased out of the project as soon as it could be accomplished after the Bay of Pigs or after the invasion was not successful. Rosselli, Giancana, and Trafficant, however, carried on plotting, and in 1963 they managed to smuggle a batch of botulinum toxin pills into Cuba disguised as a bottle of aspirin. The perfect opportunity to deploy them soon arrived when Castro visited the Havana Libre Hotel, which served his favorite chocolate milkshakes. Interestingly, Castro was such an ice cream aficionado that in 1966 he spearheaded the construction of Havana's famous Coppelia, a massive ice cream parlor which seated 1,000 guests and served a then impressive 26 different flavors. Yet, despite the mob having found the perfect delivery mechanism for Castro's poison, once again the plot quickly unraveled. When the would-be assassin went to retrieve the poisoned capsule from the freezer where he had hidden it, he found it frozen to the wall. His attempts to free the capsule caused it to rupture, scuppering the assassination attempt. Here was the closest they came to actually killing Fidel Castro. But this failure was not for lack of trying. For over the next decade, the agency would hatch a dizzying array of harebrained assassination schemes, each more outlandish than the next. One such plot involved planting a conch shell packed with explosives near a reef where Castro liked to scuba dive. The shell was even painted in bright colors to make it especially attractive. Other schemes involved blowing Castro's head off with exploding cigars, pushing him into a vat of molten metal while he toured a steel mill, injecting him with a poison-tipped needle disguised as a pen, shooting him with a gun hidden in a television camera, or killing him with a grenade disguised as a baseball, another of Castro's favorite pastimes. Of course, none of these attempts proved successful, and in 1976 the findings of the Church Committee, a US Senate group established to investigate abuses by the CIA, FBI, NSA, and IRS, prompted President Gerald Ford to pass a series of intelligence service reforms which, among other things, banned the assassination of foreign leaders. This effectively brought Operation Mongoose to an end. Like the Bay of Pigs invasion, Mongoose had turned into an embarrassing failure for the US government, swallowing countless millions of dollars while accomplishing little of substance. Meanwhile, the US government had found more effective ways of containing Cuban influence. Following the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, the United States imposed a complete trade embargo against Cuba. But while the CIA was no longer allowed to assassinate Castro directly, they continued to work with Cuban exiles and other anti-Castro forces. As recently as 2000, former CIA operative Luis Posada was arrested in Panama for planting explosives in a podium where Castro was scheduled to speak. Castro's security detail found and removed the explosives, and Castro's speech proceeded as planned. In 2004, Panamanian President Mireya Moscoso pardoned and released Posada, who subsequently fled to the United States. According to former Cuban intelligence officer Fabian Escalante, over his lifetime, Fidel Castro survived a whopping 638 assassination attempts. This number, however, is highly debated, with declassified CIA records confirming only 8 officially sanctioned plots. Nonetheless, Castro's apparent invulnerability became a part of his public image, with the leader once claiming that if surviving assassination attempts were an Olympic event, I would win the gold medal. On another occasion, Castro was offered a Galapagos tortoise as a gift, but upon learning it would live for 100 years or more, he declined the offer, quipping, "That's the problem with pets. You get attached to them, and then they die on you." Indeed, for a man forever in the world's crosshairs, Castro lived an astonishingly long life, with the leader stating on his 90th birthday that, "Never would such an idea have occurred to me. It was not the fruit of any effort. It was the whim of fate. Soon I will be like all the rest." These words would prove to be prophetic, for 3 months later, on November the 25th, 2016, Fidel Castro finally died, not from an exploding cigar or a poison milkshake, but it was the killer that gets us all in the end: time. On August 4th, 1945, William Averill Harriman, United States Ambassador to the Soviet Union, received a delegation of the Vladimir Lenin All-Union Pioneers, the Soviet equivalent of the Boy Scouts. As a symbol of cooperation between the two Allied nations during the still-raging Second World War, the young pioneers presented Harriman with a gift, a hand-carved wooden version of the Great Seal of the United States. For 7 years, the seal sat in the study of Speyzo House, the ambassador's official residence in Moscow. Little did anyone suspect, however, that this supposed gift of friendship was actually a Trojan horse, concealing a listening device so sophisticated that it would take the brightest minds in US intelligence to finally track it down and crack its secrets. This is the story of The Thing, the ingenious creation of an unexpected inventor that pioneered a technology that we still use to this day. Spyzo House, a large new Empire-style mansion at Spasopolskaya Square in Moscow, was built in 1913 for Russian textile industrialist Nikolai Vitorov. Confiscated by the Bolshevik government following the 1917 revolution, the house became the official residence of the US ambassador in 1933, the year the Soviet Union re-established diplomatic relations with the US. From the beginning, it was widely known that the Soviet Secret Service, or NKVD, later the KGB, had spies everywhere, so much so that by the 1950s, visitors visitors to Spaso House were given cards reading, "Every room is monitored by the KGB. All of the staff are employees of the KGB. We believe the garden also may be monitored. Your luggage may be searched 2 or 3 times a day. Nothing is ever stolen, and they hardly disturb things." Nonetheless, Ambassador Harriman did nothing to have his gift from the young pioneers checked for listening devices. This, however, was more the product of haste than imprudence. After all, there was a war on, and with no time for interior decoration, Harriman simply set the wooden seal aside. It was not until some months later that an unknown staffer removed the seal from storage and hung it in Harriman's study. When in April 1946, Harriman's term as ambassador came to an end, he found the seal too large to fit in his luggage and decided to leave it in place for his successor, Army General and later CIA Director Walter Bedell Smith. And so, the seal remained in place for 7 years, only being removed once to have a crack in its rim repaired. By the early 1950s, the proliferation of electronic surveillance was such that then Ambassador George F. Kennan began ordering regular sweeps of Spaso House by Secret Technical Surveillance Countermeasures, or TSCM teams. As part of these sweeps, the Great Seal was twice examined using radio receivers and metal detectors. However, these examinations revealed no wires, power sources, signal emissions, or hidden metal components outside of a few metal screws. The seal was thus declared clean and rehung on the study wall. It was not until 1951 that the seal's dirty little secret was finally revealed, albeit entirely by accident. In that year, a radio operator at the British Embassy was monitoring a radio frequency used by the Soviet Air Force when he picked up a conversation between Ambassador Keenan and the British naval attaché. Alarmed, he immediately informed US Embassy security officials, who called the 2 State Department counterintelligence experts, John W. Ford and Joseph Bezier. Unfortunately, the sweep of the building using standard detection gear turned up nothing, leading Ford and Bezier to conclude that the Soviets had removed their surveillance equipment. In late 1952, however, one Major Van Latham, an American military attaché stationed at the Embassy Chancery building, picked up a radio transmission of Ambassador Keenan's voice. Another frantic search of the building ensued, which again turned up nothing. Suspecting that the Soviets were somehow shutting off their surveillance equipment every time a search was conducted, Ford and Bezier hatched a clever plan. In early September 1952, Bezier moved into a guest room at Spaso House and remained there for several days, hosting dinner parties, playing bridge, and generally living the life of a regular house guest. Finally, on September the 12th, he arranged for Ambassador Keenan to hold a bogus dictation session in his study. The document to be dictated was an old embassy dispatch full of unimportant, unclassified information, which to an uninformed Soviet agent might sound worth collecting. Meanwhile, the embassy personnel officer, Sam Janey, snuck Bezian's detection equipment into the house and delivered it to him in the study. As soon as he turned on the detector, Bezian heard Ambassador Keenan's voice loud and clear over his headphones. The bug, wherever it was operating. As the ambassador continued to dictate, Bezian crept silently around the study, probing every nook and cranny with his detector. Finally, he homed in on the Great Seal, hanging over the ambassador's desk, which he pulled down from the wall. Suddenly, the signal cut out, only to return a moment later. Bezian laid the seal down on the armchair and scanned it more closely, revealing the signal to be emanating from the eagle's head. During the scan, Bezian accidentally bumped the seal, causing the signal to cut out again. Fearing his search had been discovered, he quickly informed the ambassador of his discovery. Suddenly, however, the signal returned, only to cut out a few minutes later. As it turns out, for the last time. Confident that he had finally located the mysterious embassy bug, Bezian carefully examined the seal and discovered a seam running around its outside edge. Grabbing a masonry hammer, he began to pry at the seam, aware that the Soviets might have hidden some sort of anti-tampering booby trap inside the seal. But the seal split apart cleanly and nothing exploded. Yet what Bezian found inside the seal would prove more explosive than any bomb. Nestled in a small cavity carved into the back of the seal was a device unlike any that Bezian had ever seen. A small cylinder, 20mm in diameter and 17mm long, from which protruded a 23mm long metal antenna. That was it. No batteries, no wires, no other recognizable components. Confused, Bezian and Janey began tearing apart the wall where the seal had hung, searching for the rest of the device. Yet despite working into the small hours of the morning, they found nothing. The entirety of the bug lay inside the wooden seal. It took weeks of careful analysis by the FBI, CIA, Naval Research Laboratory, and other electronics experts to work out how the alien device worked, and it was more fiendishly clever than the Americans could have ever imagined. The cylindrical copper body of the device was hollow and lined with highly polished silver plating, forming a carefully tuned resonant cavity. One end of the cylinder was sealed, while the other was covered with an extremely thin silver membrane that acted as a microphone diaphragm. And just a few micrometers below this diaphragm was a mushroom-shaped metal post machined with small grooves to prevent trapped air from interfering with the device's operation. Sound waves entered the seal through tiny holes drilled under the eagle's beak to cause the diaphragm to vibrate and distort, varying the distance between it and the metal post, and changing the capacitance and transmission frequency of the entire device. Instead of an internal battery, the device was powered by an external 800 MHz radio beam transmitted from a building or van across the street. The beam caused the device to resonate and transmit its own 1800 MHz signal, whose amplitude was modulated by the vibration of the microphone diaphragm, allowing the Soviets to pick up even the faintest sounds in the ambassador's study. And since the device only transmitted when illuminated by the external radio beam, the Soviets could shut it off whenever they wanted to, making it almost impossible to find using standard radio detection equipment. Its copper and silver construction also made it invisible to regular metal detectors. Given the ingenious elegance of the device, it is perhaps unsurprising that it sprang from the mind of one of Russia's greatest inventors, Lev Terman, better known in the West as Leon Theremin. Born in 1896 in St. Petersburg, Theremin was a physics and engineering prodigy, building his own laboratory and constructing all manner of advanced electrical and scientific devices before the age of 17. After a brief stint as an army engineer during the First World War and the Russian Civil War, in 1919, Theremin took a job at the Physical Technical Institute in St. Petersburg, then Petrograd, under the great Russian physicist Abram Offer. During this time, Theremin developed a radio frequency device for measuring the dielectric properties of gases, which Offer encouraged him to develop into an electronic proximity detector and burglar alarm called the Radio Watchman. In 1920, while experimenting with this device, Theremin discovered that the frequency of the radio signal changed as he moved his hand around the antenna. This discovery led to the development of Theremin's best-known invention, the eponymous, eerie-sounding electronic instrument that is played without touching it. In November of that year, Theremin gave his first public concert with the instrument and soon after embarked on a musical tour around Europe. Then in 1928, he moved to the United States and began working with RCA to perfect and market the theremin. While the newfangled instrument took the world by storm, influencing all manner of experimental music and producing new virtuoso performers like Lithuanian musician Clara Rockmore, Theremin's personal life was less successful. His wife Katia began studying medicine at school far outside of New York City, forcing the couple to see each other only rarely. Then when Katia became associated with a fascist organization, the Soviet consulate forced Theremin to divorce her to avoid political embarrassment. Theremin eventually married African-American ballet dancer Lavinia Williams, causing him to be ostracized from New York social circles. Finally, in 1938, Theremin abruptly returned to the Soviet Union. While his wife claimed that he had been kidnapped, in reality, Theremin had fled financial and tax troubles in the US. But on his arrival to the USSR, he was arrested on suspicions of crimes against the state and imprisoned at Buchacha prison. He was then sent to work in the infamous Kolma gold mines in eastern Russia and finally to Sharashka, a secret technical laboratory within the Gulag labor camp system. It was a fate he shared with many other engineers and scientists who fell out of political favor, including aircraft designer Andrei Tupolev and Sergei Korolev, later the architect of the Soviet space program. While imprisoned in the Sharashka, Theremin developed a number of surveillance devices for the NKVD, including a precursor to the laser microphone known as Buran. This used a narrow reflected beam of infrared light to measure vibrations in glass windows, allowing conversations on the other side to be detected. He also developed the endovibrator, the passive radio microphone later used in the Great Seal listening device. In 1947, Theremin was released from the Sharashka and awarded the Stalin Prize for his technical contributions. In that same year, he met and married his third wife, Maria Gushchina, and despite his imprisonment, Theremin continued to develop electronic equipment for the KGB until 1966. In 1956, he was politically rehabilitated as part of Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev's de-Stalinization program. In 1964, Theremin became a music professor at the Moscow Conservatory, but was thrown out when the administration discovered his association with electronic music, the assistant director declaring, "Electricity is not good for music. Electricity is to be used for electrocution." Nonetheless, Theremin continued to experiment and perform electronic music and in 1970 became a professor of physics in the Department of Acoustics at Moscow State University. He died in 1993 at the age of 97. As for the Great Seal bug, it remained a closely guarded government secret until May 1960, when its existence was finally revealed to the world. On May the 1st of that year, an American Lockheed U-2 spy plane was shot down over the Soviet Union, leading to the capture of its pilot, Captain Francis Gary Powers. The incident sparked an international scandal, derailing peace and disarmament talks between the US and the USSR. In response, on May the 26th, during a meeting of the United Nations Security Council, US Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. produced the Great Seal bug as proof that espionage between the two superpowers was mutual. Quote, "I produced a wooden carving of the Great Seal of the United States, which was given by some Russians to the United States ambassador to the Soviet Union, and which hung in his office behind his desk, and which contained an electronic device which made it possible for persons on the outside possessing a certain type of technical device to hear everything that went on. I produced that as a piece of evidence, and it is direct, fresh, authentic evidence to show the effectiveness and thoroughness of Soviet espionage. The discovery of the Great Seal Bug prompted the CIA to develop its own version of the resonant cavity microphone under the codename Project Easy Chair, which ran from 1954 to 1967. Other Western nations also developed similar technologies, including the UK and West Germany. But the influence of Leon Theremin's ingenious design extends far beyond the narrow field of international espionage. The concept of a passive resonator retransmitting an external radio signal is the basis of today's radio frequency identification, or RFID technology, used in anti-theft tags, identity cards, and hundreds of other devices we commonly use every single day. In all but 4 of the 25 James Bond films so far, the titular super spy starts his adventure with a visit to Q, MI6's brilliant but grumpy creator of spy gadgets. From a briefcase full of weapons to a safe-cracking cigarette case to a watch with a built-in laser, Q has exactly what 007 needs to complete his world-saving missions. Given that Ian Fleming, the creator of James Bond, worked for British intelligence during the Second World War, it is perhaps unsurprising that both the character of Q and many of his creations are based on people and equipment Fleming worked with in real life. But during the Cold War, real-life spy gadgets were confined to the West, as we covered in our previous video, The Thing, the revolutionary spy gadget that baffled the West. And yes, the intelligence services of the Eastern Bloc had their fair share of fiendishly clever contraptions. And in 1978, perhaps the most fiendish of all spy gadgets would make international headlines when it was used to carry out a bold and bizarre murder in broad daylight. Our story begins in 1969 with 40-year-old Bulgarian journalist Georgy Ivanov Markov. Born on March 1st, 1929 in the Bulgarian capital of Sofia, Markov initially pursued a career as a chemical engineer and a school teacher before becoming a writer. Starting with his first novel, The Night of Cesium, in 1957, over the following decade, Markov published dozens of novels, short stories, and plays, becoming one of Bulgaria's most successful and influential writers. However, his writing was increasingly seen as critical of the Bulgarian Communist Party and its leader, Todor Zhikov. This led to several of his works being censored and banned. Though Markov was a closer personal friend of Zhivkov, the relationship could only keep him out of trouble for so long, and in 1969, under intense pressure to conform to the Communist Party line, he left Bulgaria and settled in Bologna, Italy, with his brother. Although Markov hoped to return to Bulgaria once the heat had died down, in 1971 the Bulgarian government refused to extend his passport and he decided to stay in the West. In 1972, Markov moved to London, learned English, and began working for the Bulgarian section of the BBC World Service as a writer and broadcaster. Meanwhile, back in Bulgaria, Markov's works were removed from libraries and bookstores, and Markov himself expelled from the Union of Bulgarian Writers and sentenced in absentia to 6 years and 6 months in prison for defecting to the West. Markov thrived in London, writing and staging a number of plays, including Archangel Michael, which won first place in an Edinburgh festival. In 1975, he married English-born Annabel Rilke, a fellow broadcaster at the BBC, and a year later the couple had a daughter, Alexandra Rayner. In 1975, Markov began writing freelance scripts for Radio Free Europe and the West German radio station Deutsche Welle, which broadcast pro-Western propaganda into Eastern Europe. These scripts included the series In Absentia Reports, broadcast weekly on Radio Free Europe, which exposed and scrutinized life under the Bulgarian communist regime. These broadcasts formed the basis for Markov's memoir, The Truth That Killed, posthumously published in 1984. In addition to criticizing the policies and practices of the regime, Markov also called out its hypocrisy and corruption, revealing, among other things, the mistresses and other indiscretions of top party leaders. His broadcasts grew even more vitriolic in 1977 when his father became terminally ill and the Bulgarian government denied Markov and his brothers permission to visit him in his final days. Infuriated by Markov's unceasing attacks, President Zhivkov decided to rid him of the troublesome dissident. The assassination was directed by Minister of the Interior Dmitry Stoyanov and carried out by the Bulgarian Secret Service, the Državna Sigurnost. At Stoyanov's request, the Soviet KGB agreed to provide technical assistance on the condition that no trace of the Soviet involvement would be left. It's now known that 3 separate attempts were made on Markov's life. The first took place during a dinner party with colleagues from Radio Free Europe, while the second took place in Sardinia, where Markov was vacationing. But the third, and ultimately successful attempt, took place on September 7th, 1978, in the heart of downtown London. That day, Markov was working a double shift at the BBC. After working an early morning shift, he went home to rest for a few hours. On his return for the afternoon shift, he parked his car south of Waterloo Bridge and headed to a nearby bus stop to catch the bus to BBC headquarters at Bush House in the Strand. As he approached the bus stop, Markov felt a sharp pain in his right thigh and turned to see a man behind him bent to the ground picking up an umbrella. The man apologized in a thick foreign accent, then climbed into a nearby taxi and sped away. On arriving to work, Markov inspected his leg and discovered a small pimple-like swelling on his thigh and a matching spot of blood on his jeans. Otherwise, however, he was unhurt. But when he returned home at the end of the day, he suddenly began to feel extremely ill, spiking a high fever. The following morning, the condition had deteriorated so much that his wife had him admitted to St. James's Hospital. Delirious, Markov insisted that he had been poisoned by the Bulgarian government, but few of his doctors believed him. Instead, the attending physician, Dr. Bernard Riley, tested Markov for a host of potential ailments, even a venomous snake bite. He did, however, order an X-ray of the swelling on Markov's leg, but this revealed nothing. On account of his high white cell counts, Markov was diagnosed with septicemia or blood poisoning and placed in intensive care. Yet despite the doctor's best efforts, Markov died 4 days later on September the 11th, age 49. While doctors at St. James's did not take Markov's claims of poisoning seriously, the Metropolitan Police did and ordered a thorough autopsy of the body. The autopsy was conducted by Rufus Crompton, who rediscovered the tiny puncture wound and swelling on Markov's right thigh and extracted tissue samples from the area for further analysis. These samples were sent to Porton Down, the British Ministry of Defence Chemical and Biological Weapons Lab. Here, they were analysed by Research Medical Officer David Gall, who soon made an unusual discovery. Embedded in one tissue sample was a tiny metal pellet, 1.5 millimeters in diameter, smaller than the head of a pin. Further examination revealed that the pellet was made of a platinum iridium alloy and cross-drilled with two 0.35 millimeter holes, forming an X-shaped cavity, only 0.28 cubic millimeters in volume. Though no traces of poison were ever detected, Markov's symptoms and the minuscule dose used ruled out all but one culprit: ricin. Ricin is a lectin or carbohydrate-binding protein found in the seeds of the castor oil plant, Ricinus communis. These seeds are processed worldwide to produce castor oil, used in a wide variety of products including soaps, waxes, polishers, lubricants, and laxatives. While the process of making castor oil destroys all traces of ricin, making it safe for human consumption, the leftover bean waste contains high levels of the toxin, which can be readily extracted. Once inside the body, ricin inhibits the action of ribosomes, structures inside cells which assemble amino acids into proteins. The body's cells are thus unable to produce the proteins they require to maintain proper functioning, leading to multiple organ failure and eventually death. When injected, the median lethal dose for ricin is only around 22 micrograms, exactly the amount contained in the pellet found in Georgy Markov's leg. Based on their analysis of Markov's testimony prior to his death, scientists at Porton Down hypothesized that the pellet had been fired into Markov's leg using an air rifle disguised as an umbrella, the same umbrella Markov had seen being picked up by the fleeing foreign stranger. The pellet had also likely been coated in a sugar-like substance designed to melt at human body temperature, causing it to release its toxic payload immediately after injection. This theory was bolstered by the fact that just 3 weeks earlier, another Bulgarian exile and dissident, Vladimir Kostov, had suffered a nearly identical attack. On August the 27th, Kostov, the former head of the Paris Bureau of the Bulgarian State Radio and TV Network, was leaving the Arc de Triomphe metro station when he heard a sharp crack and felt a stinging pain in the right side of his back. Platinum iridium pellet, identical to the one found in Georgy Markov, was later extracted from the wounds, though mercifully it failed to release its poison and Kostov made a complete recovery. Just days after Markov's death, a joint investigation was launched by Scotland Yard's Anti-Terrorist Squad, Special Branch, and the Criminal Investigative Department of the Metropolitan Police. Their first order of business was to track down the taxi which had driven the alleged assassin from the scene in the hopes of obtaining a more detailed description. Yet despite questioning hundreds of taxi drivers, the investigation came up empty. Soon, every other lead dried up and the case went cold. Georgy Markov was buried at the Church of St. Candida and Holy Cross in Dorset, the identity of his assassin remaining a mystery. It wasn't until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 that further details of the Markov affair began to come to light. Two former KGB officers, Oleg Kalugin and Oleg Gordievsky, publicly confirmed that the KGB had indeed developed ricin-firing umbrellas and that several such devices were provided to the Bulgarian Secret Service. Indeed, following the collapse of the Bulgarian communist regime in 1989, a stockpile of assassin umbrellas were discovered in the Ministry of the Interior in Sofia. Kalugin and Gordievsky further identified the perpetrator in both the Kostov and Markov assassinations as Francesco Galino, a Danish hitman of Italian extraction. In 1970, Galino was arrested for smuggling drugs and currency into Bulgaria and recruited into the Bulgarian Secret Service. Given the codename Agent Piccadilly, he worked out of Denmark as an antiquities salesman, a cover which allowed him to freely travel throughout Europe without raising suspicion. Bulgarian records indicate that Galino flew into London 3 times in 1977 and 1978, leaving the day after Georgy Markov was attacked. In spite of these revelations, however, UK investigators were unable to track down and apprehend Galino, who remains officially at large. With the collapse of communism in Bulgaria, Georgy Markov's image and reputation were gradually rehabilitated, and in 2000 the author was posthumously awarded the Order of Stara Planina, Bulgaria's highest civilian honor. The citation for the award praised Markov's significant contribution to the Bulgarian literature, drama, and non-fiction, and for his exceptional civic position and confrontation to the communist regime. While assassination by poisoned umbrella may seem like the sort of absurd incident that could only have taken place during the Cold War, astonishingly, a similar crime was committed in Hanover, Germany as recently as 2011. On July the 15th of that year, 40-year-old software engineer Christoph Bulwin was walking home from work when he noticed a strange man waiting on the sidewalk ahead of him holding an umbrella. Instinctively, Bulwin crossed the street, but the man followed him and stabbed him in the left buttock with the umbrella, to the ends of which he had affixed a syringe. Bulwin fought back and chased his assailant, but he managed to escape. Believing he had been maliciously infected with HIV or some other bloodborne pathogen, Bulwin immediately had himself examined by a doctor, but every test turned up negative. However, a week later, he began to feel ill, his condition rapidly deteriorating until at the end of August he slipped into a coma. Blood work revealed levels of mercury 2,000 times higher than normal, indicating that Bulwin had been injected with methylmercury, an extremely neurotoxic compound. Though at first his condition seemed to improve, Bulwin remained in a coma for 10 months before dying from a seizure in May 2012. Though police managed to find witnesses who claimed to have seen the assailant and compile a detailed description, they were ultimately unable to track him down. The killer's identity and his motives for killing Christoph Bulwin remain a mystery to this very day. So if there is a moral to this whole macabre saga, it might be beware of strange people with umbrellas, or if you happen to be a suave international super spy, be sure to return all your equipment intact. There's no telling what nasty surprises your long-suffering quartermaster might cook up for you. On September the 17th, 1964, a cinematic juggernaut exploded onto film screens. Goldfinger, the third outing by Sean Connery's suave gentleman spy James Bond. While the 2 previous entries in the series, 1962's Dr. No and 1963's From Russia with Love, had been successful, Goldfinger was an entirely different beast. The first true blockbuster of the franchise, it made back its $3 million budget in only 2 weeks and grossed $46 million, around $440 million today over its initial theatrical run, making it the fastest grossing picture in history. It also cemented the so-called Bond formula and turned the franchise into the cinematic powerhouse that's still going strong today. Like most good Bond movies, one of the film's great strengths lies with the villain, bombastic, megalomaniacal gold tycoon Auric Goldfinger, who plots to break into Fort Knox and irradiate the United States' gold reserves. But while Goldfinger may seem like the type of larger-than-life character that could exist only in the fantastical, hyper-stylized world of James Bond, he was, in fact, based on a real person. This is the strange story of how a petty feud over, of all things, architecture led to the creation of one of spy fiction's most iconic villains. The 1964 film Goldfinger is based on the 1959 novel of the same name, the 7th in the James Bond series by British author Ian Fleming. Fleming, who had served in naval intelligence during the Second World War, based many of the characters and scenarios in his books on his own experiences. For example, the golf game between Bond and Goldfinger early in the book was inspired by a real golf game Fleming played in 1957, while names of characters like the ill-fated Masterson sisters and the improbably named henchwoman Pussy Galore were drawn from people Fleming knew in the intelligence community. And so it was with the novel's main villain, whom Fleming named after an influential but controversial Hungarian-English architect named Erno Goldfinger. Born in 1902 to a wealthy Jewish family in Budapest, in 1920, Goldfinger traveled to Paris to study at the prestigious École de Beaux-Arts. Here, he mingled with a veritable who's who of mid-century artists and designers, including Man Ray, Lee Miller, Max Ernst, and Charles-Édouard Jeanneret, better known as Le Corbusier, many of whom would go on to become leading figures in the burgeoning modernist movement. Encompassing nearly every field of human creativity, from music to literature to interior design, modernism sought to break from the traditions of the past and create new aesthetics, more in line with the scientific and industrial 20th century. In architecture, this meant stripping away unnecessary ornaments and creating structures that were true to the character of the materials they were built from, rather than mere recreations of past styles. The movements also incorporated a type of functionalism in which buildings were seen as machines for living, which could be used as instruments influence to shape and improve society. This thinking was greatly influenced by socialist principles, with many architects seeing modern architecture as the key to housing large numbers of people in an efficient and egalitarian manner. Indeed, it was while studying in Paris that Erno Goldfinger first publicly declared himself a communist, a political stance that he would maintain for the rest of his life and which would greatly inform his architectural philosophy, which he described in 1941 as cities can become centers of civilization where men and women can live happy lives. The technical means exist to satisfy human needs. The will to plan must be aroused. There is no obstacle but ignorance and wickedness. Over the following decade, Goldfinger remained in Paris, where he worked as a designer of furniture and home interiors, both solo and in partnership with fellow Beaux-Arts student André Saversy. In 1931, he met Ursula Blackwell, wealthy heiress to the British Cross and Blackwell food brand fortune. The two married in 1933 and a year later produced a son, Peter. The birth of his son inspired Goldfinger to maintain correspondence with British education experts Paul and Mary Abbott, who throughout the 1920s carried out pioneering research on the role of toys in children's mental and physical development. Based on the Abbott's findings, Goldfinger designed a series of toys specifically intended to foster learning, among the first of their kind in the world. In 1934, with anti-Semitism on the rise in Europe, the Goldfingers moved to London, becoming naturalized British citizens shortly thereafter. It was in London in the late 1930s that Erno Goldfinger would accept his first architectural commission, a series of 3 modernist houses on Willow Road in Hampstead, one of which Goldfinger built for himself. Still an avowed communist, when the Soviet Union joined the Western Allies in 1941, Goldfinger engaged in a number of advocacy efforts in support of the regime, including a 1942 Aid for Russia fundraising party attended by several prominent artists. After the war, Goldfinger continued to receive architectural commissions, most of which he executed in a controversial style which had recently become popular: brutalism. Named for the French term béton brut, or raw concrete, brutalism was the most extreme manifestation of the modernist principles of functionalism and honesty of materials. Brutalist buildings typically featured rough-cast, unpainted concrete walls, harsh geometric shapes, and little or no ornamentation. Unsurprisingly, this movement attracted the ire of a great many more traditionally minded architectural critics, including no less a figure than Charles, Prince of Wales, who in a speech before the Royal Institute of Architects in 1984 stated, "You have, ladies and gentlemen, to give this much to the Luftwaffe. When it knocked down our buildings, it didn't replace them with anything more offensive than rubble." We did that, and we assume at this point he dropped the microphone. Unfortunately for Charles and other critics, in the post-war years, brutalist architects like Goldfinger found a ready audience as cities across Europe, devastated by the conflict, sought cost-effective ways to rehome millions of people. Among Goldfinger's best-known projects are the Metro Central Heights housing complex, completed between 1959 and 1967, and the Balfron and Trellick tower blocks, completed in 1967 and 1972, respectively. The latter are notable for their space-saving features, such as sliding doors between rooms and a separate tower housing the heating plant, elevators, stairs, laundrettes, and other service infrastructure. In keeping with his political beliefs, Goldfinger also designed the headquarters for the British Communist Party and the communist newspaper The Daily Worker. As you might have guessed by now, one of the many individuals who was not a fan of Goldfinger's architecture was Ian Fleming. There are differing accounts as to how Goldfinger first appeared on Fleming's radar. According to some sources, their feud began in 1934 with the construction of the houses on Willow Road. The project involved the demolition of Victorian-era cottages on the site, which an outraged Fleming and many fellow Londoners petitioned unsuccessfully to prevent. According to other sources, however, Fleming learned of Goldfinger through his golf partner John Blackwell, who was a cousin of the architect by marriage and loathed the man, and there was much to dislike about Goldfinger besides his architecture. Despite his noble goals regarding social housing, Goldfinger was by most accounts an arrogant, humorous man, prone to bullying those who got in his way and single-mindedly devoted to his vision of urban development to the exclusion of what ordinary people actually found appealing. But whatever the reason, Fleming found the name Goldfinger irresistible, and in 1958 used the architect as the basis for Bond's next foe, changing the character's name from Erno to Auric after the Latin word for gold. According to historian Henry Chancellor, Fleming likely also drew inspiration from American gold tycoon Charles Engelhard Jr., who, like the fictional Goldfinger, used this company, the Precious Metals Development Company, to circumvent export restrictions and sell gold in countries where its price was higher. Upon learning of the title and villain of Fleming's novel, the real Goldfinger became incensed and threatened to sue Fleming's publisher, Jonathan Cape, claiming that, as there were so few Goldfingers in Britain, the choice of name was obviously a personal attack. With the initial run of the novel already printed but not yet released, the publisher was understandably nervous and did some research on the architect, informing Fleming that we discovered quite a bit, none of it very pleasant, and all of it made us unusually wary. But Fleming refused to be bullied, pointing out that there were in fact many Goldfingers listed in the phone book. At this point, viewers familiar only with the 1964 film adaptation may be wondering what all the fuss was about, for while the fictional Goldfinger is dastardly and ruthless, as portrayed by German actor Gert Frobe, he is nonetheless depicted as cunning, wealthy, and charming. However, this version of Goldfinger is significantly watered down. The original book version of the character is much, much worse. Essentially a collection of traits Fleming found despicable, Book Goldfinger is depicted as a short, ugly, red-headed, teetotaling Jewish Marxist in league with the Soviets, with a penchant for cheating at cards and golf, a tacky sense of style, and a body Fleming describes as being like he had been put together with bits of other people's bodies. And while movie it's good. And while movie Goldfinger's obsession with gold is on full display, the book exaggerates this trait to a grotesque degree, with Goldfinger owning a gold-bound volume of erotic photographs and covering his lovers head to toe in gold paint before having sex with them. So, you can see why the real Goldfinger might have been a little annoyed at Fleming. The two parties remained deadlocked until Fleming, in a stroke of glorious pettiness, threatened to release the novel with an erratum slip, changing all instances of the name Goldfinger to Goldprick. Unsurprisingly, the real Goldfinger backed down, and the matter was finally settled when Jonathan Cape agreed to include an all characters are fictional disclaimer in the book and sent the architect some complimentary copies. According to Goldfinger's biographer, the architect believed that the novel, at a time considered little more than a pulpy potboiler, would soon be forgotten, little suspecting the global phenomenon the film adaptation would become. Indeed, for decades following the film's release, Goldfinger and his family endured endless late-night crank calls in which pranksters would intone in bad Sean Connery accents, "Goldfinger, this is 007. You did say it had to be bad, or sing Shirley Bassey's iconic theme tune. In the end, it's difficult to say who had the last laugh, Goldfinger or Fleming. On the one hand, while the fictional Goldfinger has become one of the most iconic villains in cinema history, his real-life counterpart is all but forgotten outside the relatively narrow field of brutalist architecture. Furthermore, criticism by Fleming and others about the dreariness and depressiveness of Goldfinger's designs proved prophetic, as his bow front and Trellick tower blocks quickly succumbed to the blight of urban decay, becoming poorly maintained hotbeds of poverty, drug abuse, vandalism, prostitution, and other social ills. And in an even greater irony, the Metro Central Heights complex, originally named Alexander Fleming House after the discoverer of penicillin, became infamous for making its residents sick due to poor ventilation, forcing the Department of Health and Social Services to abandon the complex as its headquarters. On the other hand, however, in more recent years, the architectural community has come around on Goldfinger's work, recognizing it as significant to the history of architecture. Indeed, several of his creations, including Trellick Tower, Metro Central Heights, and the modernist Teesdale House in Surrey, now enjoy Grade 2 listing as protected historic buildings. It's the sort of recognition that would have made Ian Fleming livid, meaning that we can probably call this particular feud a draw. Bonus facts. In adapting Fleming's novel to the screen, screenwriters Richard Malbaum and Paul Den did far more than tone down the villain's more unsavory traits. Indeed, the changes the pair made are considered by many critics to have resulted in a far more cohesive and compelling story. For example, in the novel, Goldfinger plans to break into Fort Knox by blowing open the vault with a tactical nuclear weapon, then stealing the gold by loading it onto trucks and carting it away. However, Malbaum and Den found this notion ridiculous, for given the sheer volume and weight of gold in the repository, it would realistically take hundreds of trucks and nearly 2 weeks to cart it all away. Instead, the pair came up with a much more elegant plot, wherein Goldfinger plans to detonate the bomb inside Fort Knox itself, irradiating the US's gold supply and causing the value of his own gold to increase substantially. And as a sly jab at Fleming's original plot, the film has Bond point out to Goldfinger the impracticality of robbing Fort Knox, only for Goldfinger to turn the tables and reveal his actual plan. Another positive change from book to film concerns the characterization of Goldfinger's main henchwoman, Pussy Galore. In the novel, Pussy is explicitly stated to be a lesbian and heads an all-female gang of acrobats turned cat burglars called the Cement Mixers. Yet despite Pussy's stated sexuality, Bond is still able to seduce her and turn her to his side through his sheer masculine charisma, with Fleming explaining that Pussy isn't really a lesbian but simply hates men on account of her being raped as a child. Yikes indeed. But while the film makes Pussy straight, avoiding that particular minefield of misogynist pop psychology, it is far from perfect, for Bond's seduction and conversion of Pussy is accomplished by, shall we say, less than consensual means. ladies and gentlemen, the 1960s. Finally, one of the strangest differences between the book and the film is that of Auric Goldfinger's voice. While in the book, Goldfinger is explicitly stated to be British, in the film he speaks with a thick German accent. While at first glance this is readily explained by Goldfinger being portrayed by German actor Gert Frobe, in reality, Frobe's command of English was shaky and he was forced to learn most of his lines phonetically. The final result was deemed unacceptable by the studio, and so all of Frobe's lines were dubbed over by English actor Michael Collins, who chose to closely emulate Frobe's original accent. This disconnect between the character's backstory and voice results in one of the film's strangest lines, in which the CIA agent Felix Leiter informs Bond that he's British, but he doesn't sound like it. And now another bonus fact. The film Goldfinger is packed with wall-to-wall iconic Bond moments, from the iconic theme tune sung by Shirley Bassey to Bond girl Jill Masterson covered head to toe in gold paint. There's also Goldfinger threatening to cut Bond in half with a giant laser, and henchmen oddjob dispatching enemies with the toss of a razor-brimmed bowler hat. But perhaps one of the most quintessentially James Bond moments occurs in the film's pre-title sequence, in which Bond swims up to an unnamed Central American country's shoreline and proceeds to infiltrate and blow up a large drug operation. His mission complete, Bond proceeds to strip off his wetsuit, revealing a perfectly dry and perfectly pressed white tuxedo, complete with a red carnation on his lapel. But while this might seem like the sort of stylized, tongue-in-cheek nonsense the James Bond series has become legendary for, incredibly, this particular bit was actually inspired by a real-life secret mission from the Second World War. In 1941, Dutch resistance fighter Peter Tazelaar was tasked with investigating methods of infiltrating secret agents into the Nazi-occupied Netherlands. The mission, rather unimaginatively titled Contact Holland, called for Tazelaar to be dropped by boat off the seaside resort town of Scheveningen, infiltrate a German officers' party at the local casino, and to make contact with British intelligence using a radio dropped to him by parachute. On October the 23rd, Tazelaar swam ashore and stripped off his dry suit, not a wetsuit as depicted in the film, to reveal a full tuxedo. He then doused himself in brandy and stumbled up to the casino, pretending to be a drunken reveller who had gone for a seaside stroll. The act was so convincing that German guards let Tazelaar pass and he was able to enter the casino undetected. However, the mission was a failure, for Tazelaar's radio was damaged in the drop and sea conditions around the area proved too rough to safely extract Dutch agents by boat. Nonetheless, the improbable mission helped inspire one of the most memorable moments in the history of spy cinema, though there's no evidence Tazelaar ever wore a snorkel topped with a stuffed seagull. That's the sort of thing only Sean Connery could make look cool.
A properly made martini is mostly dry gin with a bit of dry vermouth and ice. Epicurious recommends 5 parts gin to 1 part vermouth. All 3 should be placed in a cocktail shaker, but rather than shaking, they should be stirred to gently combine the ingredients, and in fact stirred with a wooden spoon rather than a metal one to reduce impacting the drink's temperature. Shaking such a mixture would have several deleterious effects that would normally offend the sensibilities of a martini connoisseur. It would dilute the drink via melting more ice, make it cloudier via aeration, which result in the drink being served much colder than normal, and would bruise the included gin via the dissolved air. In fact, shaking cocktails is generally only recommended for those drinks that are intended to be aerated and frothy, like a Tom Collins or a margarita. Others are either built, such as a highball, where the ingredients are simply poured on top of the other in a glass and served, or stirred, such as the martini or a Manhattan. So why precisely would such a sophisticated man such as James Bond, who has impeccable mastery of culinary etiquette, repeatedly make the obvious faux pas of asking for his martinis shaken, not stirred? One prominent theory is that he was consciously trying to lower the potency of his beverage, thereby giving the appearance of heavy drinking without actually doing so, which could lull his nemesis into a false sense of security while also assuring he kept his wits about him. As noted, shaking the martini results in much more of the ice melting than with gentle stirring, ultimately diluting the drink and simultaneously making it colder faster. The line in Casino Royale where he invents a drink of his own creation, Vesper, is often used as evidence of his preference for cold temperature. In Chapter 7, Bond notes he wants a dry martini in a deep champagne goblet, 3 measures of Gordon's, 1 of vodka, half a measure of Quina Lillet. Shake it very well until it's ice cold, then add a thin slice of lemon peel. Got it? It has also been noted that Bond's preference of including vodka necessitates the extra chill on the drink to avoid having it taste like lighter fluid. Many martini connoisseurs would also argue that a vodka martini is no martini at all. Another theory notes that Ian Fleming, Bond's creator, switched to vodka martinis while writing the Bond novels, and perhaps some of his vodka was of an inferior quality. Sometimes cheaper vodkas, such as certain cheap potato vodkas, have a bit of excess oil in them, and shaking the mixture to create the emulsion helps hide that taste. Evidence to back this up is also found in Casino Royale, where Bond notes that vodka from grain, rather than potatoes, improves the taste of the drink. The third, somewhat more humorous theory is a bit more complicated to explain. James Bond, like his creator Ian Fleming, seemed to enjoy a broad range of liquor. In the books, he drank scotch much more frequently than martinis, and his brands of choice included Macallan, Hague and Hague, Johnny Walker, Dewar's, and Black and White. Bond also drank other whiskies, including Jack Daniel's, Canadian Club, Old Grandad, Virginia Gentleman, Suntory, and Harper. In fact, Bond drank so much that in a highly entertaining December 2013 scientific report published in the BMJ, formerly the British Medical Journal, doctors opined that Bond was an alcoholic and headed for an early grave for this reason, if not due to his dangerous profession, or at least was likely to suffer from impotent liver disease and a variety of other health problems associated with intemperance with respect to alcohol consumption. According to the researchers who perused the James Bond novels for their data, over the 123.5 days covered in the stories they looked at, Bond consumed an astounding 9,201.2 grams of pure alcohol in the various drinks he partook in. This means he drank an average of 521.6 grams of pure alcohol each week, an amount several times that recommended by the British National Health Service. They concluded their paper noting that James Bond was unlikely to be able to stir drinks even if he would have wanted to, because of the likely alcohol-induced tremor. Shaking his drinks would have helped hide this fact from his adversaries and further help hide that he was a high-functioning alcoholic from his superiors. And now for a bonus fact. The name James Bond is actually that of an ornithologist. Originally, Fleming wanted James Bond to be a boring, ordinary man who happened to experience some extraordinary things. He knew about an ornithologist named James Bond from Bond's book, Birds of the West Indies, which he had read in his youth and thought that the author's name was one of the most boring names he'd ever heard. However, the boring name soon became rather exciting. Mrs. Ornithologist Bond actually sent Fleming a letter thanking him for using the name.
The British Secret Intelligence Service, better known to the world as MI6, Military Intelligence Section 6, is rather oddly for a supposedly secretive agency, one of the better-known intelligence services in the world. While the work MI6 does today is top secret, thanks to the wonders of the Freedom of Information Act, we're able to peer into the mysterious agency's beginnings and marvel at all the many humorous things they did in their early days in the name of protecting British interests. Like that time they told agents to use their own Semen as ink when sending secret messages. We should probably mention at this point that the head of the agency telling the agents to do this was the aptly named Mansfield Smith Cumming. The history of MI6 can be traced back to 1909, when a precursor to the agency was set up by the British government to investigate German citizens who were increasingly being accused of being spies by the paranoid public. In fact, there was a growing sentiment that pretty much all German-born individuals in Britain were actually spies. As mentioned, the head of this fledgling agency, then known as the Secret Service Bureau, was one Mansfield Smith Cumming, a legendary figure in British military history, famed as much for his eccentricities as he was for his accomplishments as the first director of MI6. Cumming, or C as he was affectionately known during his tenure as director, originally standing for Cumming rather than chief as it does today when referring to an MI6 director, was formerly a Royal Navy captain who suffered from severe seasickness. Really? As you might imagine, this ultimately resulted in him being deemed unfit for service. As to why he was chosen to head up the new spy agency, this seems to have been primarily due to his impressive intelligence-gathering background. For instance, in his post-naval captain career, he was once tasked with gathering certain information while posing as a German businessman in Germany and the Balkans. So why is this impressive? Well, he reportedly succeeded in this mission despite not being able to speak a single word of German. As to the spy organization he led, in the beginning they were less James Bond and more a sort of Monty Python caricature of spying. In fact, bumbling buffoonery and gathering false information and presenting it as fact became a bit of a staple for MI6. For example, prior to World War I, C's foremost weapons expert disappeared for a time while abroad. Perhaps he was captured by some sinister foreign power. Well, no, actually the agent just couldn't find anyone to give him directions in English and he just got a bit lost. On another occasion, C was reportedly fooled by a phony document stating that German spies had extra rows of teeth. He also spent a considerable amount of the agency's scant resources searching Britain for a hidden cache of German weapons that just didn't exist. One notable victory that C achieved in those early days was a comprehensive file that he compiled on Zeppelins. Apparently, none of his superiors realized that all the information was publicly available at the time. All C did was have it translated from German to English. This report was hailed as a major victory for the British intelligence agency. When the First World War broke out, the Secret Service Bureau was overhauled and rebranded as MI6. Not that anyone publicly knew this. At the time, the British government still denied that it existed. As you might imagine, the agency being a secret made it hard to get good applicants. When potential new agents were identified, C had a novel way of interviewing them without giving away that he worked for a shadowy government agency. In short, a key facet of the selection process was the gold-monocled director suddenly and very violently stabbing himself in the leg. You see, in 1914, C lost his leg during a traffic collision in France, which tragically claimed the life of his son. While hospital reports indicate that his leg was amputated the day after the accident, C himself liked to claim that he'd cut it off himself with a penknife in order to be able to get to his dying son. At other times, though, he'd just say he lost it in a fight with a wild animal. After the accident, C mostly got around with the aid of a wooden leg and a sword that was hidden inside of a cane. In any event, C would interview potential agents pretending that he worked for a more mundane facet of the government. With the process moving along at a slothful pace, in true Monty Python skit fashion, without warning, he'd suddenly violently stab himself in his covered wooden leg mid-conversation. If the person flinched, the interview was over and the individual was asked to leave. The idea was that the flinchers were simply not good secret agent material. If they kept their composure, he'd reveal the true nature of the interview. C apparently found the reactions he sometimes got from doing this so amusing that he reportedly also decided to do it during regular state meetings. Alright, so where does Semen come into all of this? Well, like any respectable spymaster, C was very interested in covert communication, in particular invisible ink. However, a key problem was that most fluids that could function as invisible ink and the methods that could be used to reveal them were widely known. To solve this problem, in 1915, C approached scientists at London University and tasked them with discovering a new type of invisible ink. According to C's own diaries, though, Semen's use as an invisible ink wasn't discovered by anyone at the university. Instead, one of his agents, whose name is omitted from the diary for obvious reasons, made the breakthrough. After investigation, it really did turn out that, along with being a substance readily available to any male agents, when exposed to the usual detection methods of the time, such as iodine vapor, letters penned with semen ink refused to surrender their contents. Captain Cumming was apparently thrilled to learn about this use for semen, allegedly quipping that now every man has his own stylo. An altered version, every man his own stylo, was adopted by the agents as their motto for a time. Despite making a discovery that allowed British agents to communicate covertly, the agent who discovered this was so teased by other agents after the fact that he had to be moved to a different department. Understandably, the use of semen to pen secret messages led to some hilarious exchanges, such as one between an agent in Copenhagen called Major Holm and C's subordinate, Frank Stagg. In the message, Stagg was forced to tell Holm that a fresh operation was necessary for each letter after people in his office began complaining that all of Holm's letters stank. You see, Major Holm had decided to stock up a large supply of ink. In an inkwell so he didn't need to do the necessary... Major Holm had decided to stock up a large supply of ink in an inkwell, so he didn't need to do what was necessary to get fresh ink every time he wanted to send a secret letter. So to sum up, during the First World War, actual British spies had a meeting with a one-legged, gold-monocled, cane sword-carrying guy called Captain Cumming, during which he enthusiastically told them they needed to start using their own semen as invisible ink, requiring that any time they needed to send a secret message, they had to masturbate immediately before doing so. Presumably, if that practice was still around today. Oh my god. Ah. Presumably, if that practice was still around today, James Bond would have to cut back on his countless dalliances to ensure he retained a sufficient supply of ink to send lengthy messages on short notice. And now let's get into some bonus facts. According to Ian Fleming, creator of Chitty Chitty Bang Bang and the much less popular James Bond series, the eccentric quartermaster M is partially based on Mansfield Cumming. And now for another bonus fact. Speaking of Bonds, the name James Bond is actually that of an ornithologist. Originally, author Ian Fleming wanted James Bond to be a boring, ordinary man who happened to experience some extraordinary things. He knew about an ornithologist named James Bond from Bond's book Birds of the West Indies, which he had read in his youth, and thought that the author's name was one of the most boring names he'd ever heard. Thanks to Fleming, the boring name soon became rather exciting. Mrs. Ornithologist Bond actually sent Fleming a letter thanking him for using the name. In any event, you might at this point be wondering how Fleming managed to come up with such different works as Chitty Chitty Bang Bang and James Bond. Before creating these works, Fleming jumped from career to career almost as often as he switched girlfriends. He was known to be a womanizer, not that the ladies seemed to mind though, apparently they thought him very attractive. In this way, he didn't really differ that much from Bond himself. As for those jobs, he first tried to establish himself in the military, followed by an attempt to become a foreign diplomat, but both were unsuccessful. He later enjoyed a stint working for Reuters, where he learned basic journalism skills and covered a case about a Russian spy. However, he knew that there wasn't a lot of money to be had in journalism, at least not for him, and he decided to pursue a career as a stockbroker. Those plans went in the toilet as well thanks to World War II. Despite the fact that his father had died while serving in World War I when Fleming was just 9, it didn't deter him from joining the war effort. He started as a lieutenant commander, RNVR in naval intelligence, gathering information that helped the smooth running of the Allied war effort. He later became the personal assistant to the director. His work took him on many overseas visits, notably to the United States, where he had a hand in the establishment of what would become the CIA. Specifically, while on a trip to DC, Fleming worked with a group to come up with a blueprint for the Office of the Coordinator of Intelligence, a department that eventually evolved into the CIA. After the war, Fleming had taken up a job as the foreign manager of the Sunday Times, but he started talking about wanting to write the spy novel to end all spy novels. Before any writing could be accomplished, however, Fleming decided to get his life in order. First, he negotiated a contract with his employers that allowed him 3 months off a year. Then he started building a house in Jamaica. He named his house Goldeneye after a mission during the war, and he settled in to write. Some say that he started writing the novels to impress his soon-to-be wife, Anne, Lady Rothermere. He had been having an affair with Anne for several years. After she became pregnant with their second child, the first was stillborn, she divorced her husband and joined Fleming in Jamaica. But Anne had surrounded herself with writers in London, and perhaps he thought that publishing a book would allow him into that circle. Whatever the case, the first James Bond novel, Casino Royale, was published in 1953. It was written in just 2 months while Fleming was on vacation in Jamaica, a trend he continued for subsequent books. He kept on working for the Sunday Times until 1959, using his 3 months vacation to write. For the most part, the popularity of the books rose slowly but steadily, though they received a few big surges as well. First, President John F. Kennedy cited From Russia with Love as one of his favorite reads, resulting in sales rising sharply in the United States. Secondly, the first James Bond movie, Dr. No, was released in 1962, starring the talented Sean Connery as Bond, and that, of course, provided another surge. But Ian Fleming, he wouldn't live to see exactly how huge his books and subsequent movies would become. He was suffering from heart disease, and he had his first heart attack in 1962. Told not to work during his recovery, he started writing a book on the sly for his only son, Caspar, who was 10 at the time. This adventuresome novel was a fantastic tale about a flying car, Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. This book would, of course, go on to be made into a movie that would become a family classic, but Fleming was never able to see it for himself. Ian Fleming died on his son's 12th birthday, August 12, 1964. Needless to say, that was quite the traumatic experience for a boy to suffer at a young age, and Caspar was plagued by mental health issues in his teen years, and he ultimately committed suicide in 1975 at the age of just 23. Nevertheless, Fleming's legacy, it lives on. His Bond books, as well as Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, have never left print. Fleming proved to be a talented writer whose books were able to stand the test of time with great descriptions, interesting characters, and an engaging plot. On that note, in an article about how to write a thriller, Fleming said it was easy. There is only one recipe for a bestseller. You have to get the reader to turn over the page. Her name was Virginia Hall, an American spy born in Baltimore in 1906. She attended both Barnard College and Radcliffe College, two prestigious all-women's higher education facilities, and continued her studies at schools in France, Germany, and Austria. She had dreams of a career in the Foreign Service. At just 25 years old, she was appointed to the position of consular service clerk at the American Embassy in Warsaw, Poland, and seemed to be well on her way to accomplishing her goals. Unfortunately, shortly after her appointment, she sustained an injury in a hunting accident. She accidentally shot herself in her left leg. Repairing the leg was beyond the medical technology of the time, and in 1933 it was amputated from the knee down. Hall was given a prosthetic wooden peg leg to use instead, and she seemed to take it all in her stride. She later nicknamed the prosthetic leg, which she would wear for the rest of her life, Cuthbert. Unfortunately, the disability made her ineligible to pursue her career further. For the next several years, she worked as a clerical assistant for the State Department in Turkey, Italy, and Estonia before hitting the glass ceiling in her field of work, despite a few stunning bullet points on her resume, such as the fact she was fluent in Italian, German, and French. She resigned in 1939 just as war started to inch across Europe. That said, Hall didn't flee the continent for the safer shores of her homeland. Rather, she volunteered as an ambulance driver in France until the French surrendered in 1940. From there, she evacuated to England, where she took up another clerical position at the American Embassy in London. Hall soon caught the attention of the British Special Operations Executive, which was looking for agents to work with the French resistance. Thus, in 1941, Hall posed as a correspondent for the New York Post when she arrived in Lyon, France. Her code name was Marie Monin, and she was the SOE's very first female agent in France. She spent the next 14 months providing courier services, helping downed flyers and runaway POWs escape, and obtaining materials for clandestine presses. The sales of press materials, such as paper and ink, were prohibited, making it difficult for resistance newspapers to create and spread their ideas. Nevertheless, thanks to help from Hall and others like her, by 1942, resistance papers had reached over 2 million people in France. All the while, Hall continued to send documents to the New York Post to maintain her cover. It was during this time that the Germans first became aware of Virginia Hall. French double agents had informed them of the limping lady who located drop zones for money and weapons and had established and strengthened resistance networks across France. Needless to say, her laundry list of successful missions which were helping to boost the French resistance were starting to make the Germans just a little bit upset. A wanted poster appeared bearing her likeness, and the Gestapo had clear orders. She is the most dangerous of all Allied spies. We must find and destroy her. Germany seized France in 1942, and the SOE said it was too dangerous for Hall to remain in the country, especially since the United States had since joined in the war effort. This essentially meant that even with her current disguise, she could be tortured or killed as the enemy, whether they discovered she was the limping lady or not. She escaped to Spain by walking across the snowy Pyrenees Mountains on her one good leg that November. In a communicator headquarters on her journey, Hall said simply, "Cuthbert is giving me trouble, but I can cope." She needed to use a code name for her wooden leg because the Germans were so intent on finding her that she worried that saying wooden leg would give away her position if the message was intercepted. Headquarters misunderstood her meaning and replied, "If Cuthbert is giving you trouble, have him eliminated." When she arrived in Spain after a grueling journey, she was thrown in prison because she didn't have any entry papers. 6 weeks later, she finally managed to smuggle out a letter to the embassy in Barcelona, alerting them to her predicament. Hall continued her work for the SOE in Spain after she was released, but after 4 months, she requested transfer elsewhere. She wrote, "I thought I could help in Spain, but I'm not doing a job. I'm living pleasantly and wasting time. It isn't worthwhile, and after all, my neck is my own. If I'm willing to get a crick in it, I think that's my prerogative." Hall made a convincing argument, and after another brief stint in London, becoming proficient in Morse code, she was sent again to France via a British torpedo boat. This time, she was working for the United States Office of Strategic Services. Of course, the Germans were still looking for her, and if she was found, she would likely lose her life. Taking precautions, she disguised herself as an elderly French milkmaid by dyeing her hair grey, wearing full skirts to hide her small frame, and walking with a slow, shuffling gait to disguise her limp. She made goat cheese and went into town to sell it, all the while listening to the oblivious German soldiers chatter about their work. Forced to stay on the move by German forces attempting to track her radio signals, Hall proved a slippery spy and eluded capture. When she wasn't listening in on German soldiers' banter, she trained 3 battalions of French resistance fighters to wage guerrilla warfare against the Germans. Before Allied forces overtook her team, Hall reported that they had destroyed rail lines, phone lines, bridges, and freight trains, sabotaging infrastructure
necessary to German occupation. The team was credited with killing over 150 German soldiers and capturing 500 more. For all her efforts during World War II, she was made an honorary member of the Order of the British Empire. She was also awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, one of the United States' highest military honors. She was the only civilian woman to be awarded the medal during World War II. President Truman wanted a public party to celebrate the award, but Hall opted for a private ceremony with just her mother and General William Joseph Donovan in attendance. She said she was still operational and most anxious to get busy. Therefore, she didn't want a ceremony that would make her face known. In 1951, Hall joined the CIA, working as a French parliamentary intelligence analyst, doing it all just on one leg. And if you're interested in reading more about this remarkable woman, do check out The Wolves at the Door, the true story of America's greatest female spy by Judith L. Pearson. You can find an Amazon link to it in the description below.
Hollywood spies often have a myriad of amazing devices at their disposal for getting rid of bad guys in clandestine ways. It turns out occasionally, so do real spies. Exhibit A, the CIA's undetectable poison dart gun that near silently shot frozen darts comprised of an unspecified and undetectable poison. The individual hit would reportedly at most feel something like a mosquito bite as the dart penetrated their skin. It would then quickly melt and the poison would do its work, leaving the victim dead of an apparent heart attack with no detectable evidence of the poison remaining. The weapon was revealed as part of a broader Senate investigation into intelligence and covert action abuses by the agency. The disclosure of the full gamut of activities and devices caused Senator Frank Church to conclude that the CIA had become a rogue elephant rampaging out of control. Spurred by the publication of Seymour Hersh's game-changing article in the New York Times on December 22, 1974, which relayed assassination attempts and covert activities to subvert both foreign governments as well as American anti-war and other dissidents, the Senate formed the Select Committee to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities in 1975. Chaired by Senator Church during its 2 years of hearings, the Church Committee, as it came to be known, published 14 reports on a variety of abuses by the CIA, Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, the National Security Agency, NSA, as well as others. These included routinely opening and resealing U.S. citizens' mail since 1952, misusing tax information to target domestic dissidents, and conducting domestic electronic surveillance of peace and Black Power activists. In addition, for the CIA, this also included developing weapons such as, to quote, a pistol that can fire a poison dart 328 feet, kill a man before he knows he has been hit, and leave no clue as to what killed him. Part of a program named MK Naomi, established for conducting and managing bacteriological warfare, the poison dart gun was just one of many experiments by the agency, which also included pesticides to ravage crops, and on one occasion using the NYC subway to test out a trial model of a biological warfare attack. On September 16, 1975, then CIA Director William Colby testified regarding the development of toxic agents at a laboratory at Fort Detrick. Notably, Director Colby testified that only limited records remained of these activities, even though the program spanned from 1952 to 1970. Among the director's many extraordinary statements were these from his prepared remarks. The specific subject today concerns CIA's involvement in the development of bacteriological warfare materials, retention of an amount of shellfish toxin, and CIA's use and investigation of various chemicals and drugs. The need for such capabilities was tied to the development of 2 different types of suicide pills to be used in the event of capture during World War II, and a successful operation using biological warfare materials to incapacitate a Nazi leader temporarily. A memo of 1967 identified the range of project activity, maintenance of a stockpile of temporarily incapacitating and lethal agents, assessment and maintenance of biological and chemical dissemination systems, and adaptation and testing of a dart device for clandestine and imperceptible inoculation with biological warfare or chemical warfare agents. The only application of this shellfish toxin was in the U-2 flight over the USSR in May 1960, Gary Powers' flight. Various dissemination devices, such as a fountain pen dart launcher and an engine head bolt designed to release a substance when heated, were developed. Success was never achieved for the temporarily incapacitating dart system, since a larger amount of an incapacitating agent is required to safely inactivate a human than of a lethal agent to kill him. Upon further questioning by the senators, Colby described how the poison dart gun worked. The chairman: "Does this pistol fire the dart?" Mr. Colby: Yes, the round thing at the top is obviously the sight, the rest of it is practically a normal 45. However, it works by electricity. There is a battery in the handle. The chairman: So that it fires silently? Mr. Colby: Almost silently. The chairman: And the dart itself, when it strikes the target, does the target know? Mr. Colby: That depends. There are different kinds of these flechettes, darts, and a special one was developed which potentially would enter the target without perception. The chairman: Is it not true that the effort not only involved designing a gun, but also the toxin itself would not appear in the autopsy? Mr. Colby: Yes, so there was no way of perceiving that the target was hit. Senator Tower: Turning to the dart gun, was it ever employed for any purpose by the agency? Mr. Colby: I think merely experiments. I do not know of any actual use. There is no record of any actual use. Ian Fleming was born on May 28, 1908, to a wealthy family in London. He and his three brothers were educated at Eton College, the same school Prince William and Harry attended. Fleming was supposedly a master of athletics. After Eton, he attended Sandhurst and chose to study in Munich and Geneva, where he had the Alps as a backdrop. He would later learn to ski and climb the mountains, perhaps not surprising given his athletic ability, which would also set the stage for some of his yet-to-be-conceived character in the James Bond books. Fleming jumped from career to career almost as often as he switched girlfriends. He was known to be a womanizer, not that the ladies seemed to mind though. Apparently they thought him very attractive. In this way, he didn't differ much from Bond himself. He tried to establish himself in the military, followed by an attempt to become a foreign diplomat. Both were unsuccessful. He later enjoyed a stint working for Reuters, where he learned basic journalism skills and covered a case about a Russian spy. However, he knew that there wasn't a lot of money to be had in journalism, at least not for him, and he decided to pursue a career as a stockbroker. However, the world was fast approaching World War II. Despite the fact that his father had died while serving in World War I when Fleming was just 9, it didn't deter him from entering the war effort when World War II broke out. He started out as a lieutenant commander in the RNVR in naval intelligence, gathering information that helped the smooth running of the Allied war effort. He later became the personal assistant of the director. His work took him on many overseas visits, notably to the United States, where he had a hand in the establishment of what would ultimately become the CIA. Specifically, while on a trip to DC, Fleming worked with a group to come up with a blueprint for the Office of the Coordinator of Intelligence, a department that eventually evolved into the modern CIA. Much of what Fleming learned during his time with naval intelligence likely helped to shape the Bond books, though Fleming was never able to speak openly about his work because of the Official Secrets Act. However, it is thought that his director, Admiral John Godfrey, was the inspiration for the character M. In Diamonds Are Forever, published in 1956, he wrote, "There was a creak from M's chair, and Bond looked across the table at the man who held a great deal of his affection and all his loyalty and obedience." After the war, Fleming had taken up a job as the foreign manager of the Sunday Times, but he started talking about wanting to write the spy novel to end all spy novels. This is no doubt because after the war, in which he liaised with spies but never truly became one, he had quite a lot of fodder waiting to be turned into a book. Before any writer could be accomplished, however, Fleming decided to get his life in order. First, he negotiated a contract with his employers that allowed him 3 months off every year. Then he started building a house in Jamaica. He'd fallen in love with the country when he visited during a naval intelligence meeting, and he vowed to return someday. Naming his house Goldeneye after a mission during the war, he settled down to write. Some say that he started writing the novels to impress his soon-to-be wife, Anne, or Lady Rothmere. He had been having an affair with Anne for several years. After she became pregnant with their second child, the first was stillborn, she divorced her husband and joined Fleming in Jamaica. But Anne had surrounded herself with writers in London, and perhaps he thought publishing a book would allow him into that circle. Whatever the case, the first James Bond novel, Casino Royale, was published in 1953. It was written in just 2 months while Fleming was on vacation in Jamaica, a trend that he continued for subsequent books. He kept on working for the Sunday Times until 1959, using his 3 months vacation to write. The job was actually pretty useful for his writing career. It allowed him to connect with people from all over the world, so he was able to check facts about geography, history, and culture with people who lived in the areas he was writing about if he was not able to visit himself. This, along with his tendency to include brands of items in his books, added a level of realism to his stories. For the most part, the popularity of the books rose steadily, though they received a few big surges as well. First, President John F. Kennedy cited From Russia with Love as as one of his favorite reads, resulting in sales in the United States rising sharply. Incidentally, he actually met President Kennedy and the First Lady in Washington, D.C., and reported that it was one of his favorite fan encounters. Secondly, the first James Bond movie, Dr. No, was released in 1962, starring the talented Sean Connery as
Bond. James Bond.
Fleming would also live to see From Russia with Love made into a hit film, as well as some of the filming of Goldfinger. Many more Bond films have since been created, of course, with a range of actors playing the title character. But Fleming wouldn't live to see exactly how huge his books and subsequent movies would become. He was suffering from heart disease and had his first heart attack in 1962. Told not to work during his recovery, he started writing a book on the sly for his only son Caspar, who was 10 at the time. So, was this book the next great Bond, or perhaps some sort of James Bond Jr., a novel geared for a younger audience? Well, no. The adventuresome novel was a fantastical tale about a flying car called Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. This would of course go on to be made into a movie that would become a family classic, but Fleming was never able to see this for himself. Ian Fleming died on his son's 12th birthday, August the 12th, 1964, after suffering from many different health issues. Needless to say, that was quite the traumatic experience for a boy to suffer at such a young age, and Caspar was plagued by mental health issues in his teen years until he committed suicide in 1975 at the age of 23. Nevertheless, Fleming's legacy, it lives on. His Bond books, as well as Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, have never left print. Fleming proved to be a talented writer whose books were able to stand the test of time with great descriptions, interesting characters, and an engaging plot. In an article about how to write a thriller, Fleming said it was easy, saying, "There is only one recipe for a bestseller. You have to get the reader to turn over the page." And now for a bonus fact. The name James Bond is actually that of an ornithologist. Originally, Fleming wanted James Bond to be a boring, ordinary man who happened to experience some extraordinary things. He knew about an ornithologist named James Bond from Bond's book Birds of the West Indies, which he had read in his youth, and thought that the author's name was one of the most boring names he ever heard. However, the boring name soon became rather exciting. Mrs. Ornithologist Bond actually sent Fleming a letter thanking him for using the name. On the 1st of September 1939, nearly 1.5 million troops, 2,750 tanks, and 2,300 aircraft of Adolf Hitler's Third Reich stormed over the border into Poland. That same day, Britain and France, bound by a treaty to defend Polish sovereignty, issued an ultimatum calling for the immediate withdrawal of German forces. The ultimatum was ignored, and on September the 3rd, the Allied powers declared war on Germany. And with that, the Second World War in Europe had begun. While Hitler's true goal was plain for all to see, the Führer justified the invasion as a response to growing Polish aggression, pointing to a series of attacks against German citizens both within Poland and just across the border. But while many of these attacks did indeed take place, they were carried out not by Poles, but rather German agents in a carefully coordinated false flag operation designed to give Hitler the justification he needed to launch his war of conquest. This is the shadowy story of Operation Himmler. Poland had been high on Adolf Hitler's list of grievances since taking power in Germany in 1933. On June the 28th, 1919, in the wake of the First World War, the victorious Entente powers forced a defeated Germany to sign the Treaty of Versailles, which saddled the country with the sole responsibility for starting the war and a series of harsh concessions. The country was forced to pay the modern equivalent of $33 billion in reparations, forbidden from having an air force or a standing army larger than 100,000 men, and stripped of 65,000 square kilometers of territory and all its overseas colonies. Among these territorial concessions was the creation of the Danzig Corridor, a 50-kilometer wide strip of land which connected the newly restored Polish Republic to the Baltic coast and completely cut Germany off from its territory of East Prussia. A popular narrative holds that the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, particularly the monetary reparations, were excessively harsh and led directly to the hyperinflation of the 1920s, the rise of the Nazis, and the outbreak of the Second World War. Indeed, following the signing of the treaty, Allied Supreme Commander Marshal Ferdinand Foch prophetically declared, "This is not a peace, it is an armistice for 20 years." In reality, reparations played only a partial role in Germany's post-war economic troubles, while the reparation payments themselves were cancelled in 1932 after Germany had paid only $5 billion of the $33 billion obligation. Nonetheless, for many Germans, the Treaty of Versailles was a national humiliation, and Adolf Hitler ruthlessly exploited the resentment to carry himself and his National Socialist Party to power. Hitler wasted no time reclaiming the territory lost to the Treaty of Versailles. On March the 7th, 1936, German troops reoccupied the Rhineland, which had been demilitarized since 1919, while on the 12th of March 1938, the Anschluss unified Germany and Austria into Greater Germany. Hitler next laid claim to the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia, Czechoslovakia, home to a large minority of ethnic Germans. These claims precipitated an international crisis and brought Europe to the edge of war. In desperation, in September 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flew to Munich and negotiated the handover of the Sudetenlands in return for the cessation of German territorial expansion. This compromise infamously backfired, for Hitler, emboldened by the Allied policy of appeasement, proceeded to invade the rest of Czechoslovakia on March 15, 1939. However, as there were hardly any ethnic Germans in this part of Czechoslovakia, the invasion laid bare Hitler's true intentions. Thus, when he demanded the return of the Danzig corridor to Germany, the Allied powers were far less willing to negotiate. Hitler therefore turned to his infamous Schutzstaffel, or SS, his bodyguard turned political paramilitary force, to engineer a series of supposedly Polish attacks along the border to justify the outright invasion and occupation of Poland, scheduled for August 26, 1939. On August 22nd, as troops were massing at the border, Hitler told his generals, "I will provide a propagandistic casus belli. Its credibility doesn't matter. The victor will not be asked whether he told the truth." The task of planning these false flag operations, codenamed Undetectable Himmler after Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, fell to Heinrich Müller, chief of the Gestapo secret police, and Reinhard Heydrich, head of the Sicherheitsdienst, or SD, the SS intelligence service. Operation Himmler would consist of a series of 21 staged attacks by SS troops dressed in Polish uniforms, carried out against various targets just across the German border, including the railway at Jablunka Pass, the German customs station at Hochlinden, the railway station at Alt-Eik, and the forest station at Pitzchen. The most elaborate operation, however, would be directed at the radio station Gleiwitz in Upper Silesia. Built in 1935 by German electronics firm Lorenz, the complex's 33-meter-tall antenna remains the tallest wooden structure in Europe. Upon seizing control of the station, the SS troops would use the transmitter to broadcast a pro-Polish message across Germany, providing indisputable proof of Polish aggression. And to make this and the other operations look even more convincing, inmates from the Dachau concentration camp would be dressed in Polish uniforms, drugged, shot in the face, prevented identification, and left behind at the scene of the attacks. In a classic example of dark Nazi euphemism, these planted bodies were referred to as conserve, or canned meat, leading to the common but false claim that the whole operation was codenamed Unternehmen Konserve. The man tasked with leading the attack on the Gleiwitz radio station was 29-year-old SS Sturmbannführer Alfred Naujoks, an accomplished amateur boxer and street baller from the Nazi Party's earliest days. By 1939, he had become one of Reinhard Heydrich's most trusted agents and placed in charge of the SD's foreign section, forging passports, identity cards, money, and other documents for SD agents operating abroad. As Naujoks told a reporter in 1960, Heydrich summoned him to his office and explained, "Within a month, we shall be at war with Poland. The Führer is determined. But first, we have to have something to go to war about. We've organized incidents in Danzig, along the East Prussian border with Poland, and along the German frontier. But there has to be something big and obvious." In mid-August 1939, Naujoks and a squad of 6 Polish-speaking SS soldiers traveled to Gleiwitz and checked into Oberschäsiker Hotel, claiming to be mining engineers prospecting for minerals in the area. They then went about assembling the Polish uniforms, documents, weapons, cigarettes, and other items that they'd need to carry out the staged attack. Intimately involved in this procurement process was an unexpected figure, none other than Oskar Schindler, the industrialist who had later gone to save the lives of 1,200 Jews during the Holocaust. In 1939, however, Schindler had yet to have his change of heart and still actively supported the Nazi war effort. Indeed, this was not even his first collaboration with German intelligence. In 1936, Schindler, broken desperate following a series of failed business ventures, joined the Abwehr, German military intelligence, and was assigned to spy on Czech military defenses near the town of Ostrava. Unfortunately, Schindler proved an even worse spy than he was a businessman and was soon arrested, charged with treason, and sentenced to death in August 1938. But before he could be executed, Germany invaded Czechoslovakia and Schindler was freed. He was then promoted by the Abwehr and made deputy commander of intelligence in Ostrava, which was less than 20 kilometers from Gleiwitz. Uniforms and other materials for the Gleiwitz operation were stored in Schindler's apartment, while a network of Abwehr agents under his command helped smuggle SS agents across the border into Poland. By August the 25th, everything was ready. The Naujoks and his squad awaited the code word Großmutter gestorben, or "a grandmother has died," that would set the operation in motion. However, Hitler, sensing that Poland and its allies might soon capitulate to his demands, postponed the invasion to September the 1st, leaving Najax and his men waiting for nearly 2 weeks. Finally, on the evening of August the 31st, a phone call bearing the code word arrived at the Oblastschleiser Hotel, and the squad piled into 2 cars and drove to the Gliwice radio station. Also in one of the cars, dressed in a Polish uniform and drugged into unconsciousness, was Wojciech Honiak, a 43-year-old Upper Silesian farmer who had been arrested by the Gestapo for collaborating with Polish saboteurs. The squad reached the station around 8 p.m. and stormed up the stairs and through the front door. They met no resistance from the guards and quickly overpowered them and the engineers on duty, binding and locking them in the basement. Honiak's unconscious body was then dragged from the car, shot through the back of the head, and draped over the front stairs as proof of Polish involvement in the raid. But as one of Najdok's men, Karl Hornak, prepared to make the staged pro-Polish broadcast, he realized that he had made a crucial error. The building the squad had raided contained no broadcast studios, only transmitting equipment designed to broadcast signals received via cable from the city of Breslau. After a desperate 10-minute search of the building, Hornak resorted to using an emergency storm microphone designed to warn radio listeners of inclement weather. In perfect Polish, Hornak barked over the airwaves, "Attention, this is Gliwice. The broadcasting station is in Polish hands." Hornak had intended to end the broadcast with a statement about Polish territorial claims in the region, but this part of the message was cut off, either due to technical problems or a Polish technician who managed to shut down the transmitter. But it was enough, and Najak's squad withdrew from the complex. Radio stations in Germany rebroadcast the transmission across the country as proof of Polish aggression. The other 20 Operation Himmler attacks were similarly successful, with one major exception. The squad tasked with raiding the Hochlinden customs post was not informed of the delay in the invasion plans and attacked before the post could be cleared, resulting in the deaths of several German citizens. But it hardly mattered. Hitler had his pretext for invasion. The next morning, the Führer gave a speech before the German parliament, or Reichstag, declaring, "I can no longer find any willingness on the part of the Polish government to conduct serious negotiations with us. These proposals for mediation have failed because in the meanwhile, there first of all came as an answer to the sudden Polish general mobilization, followed by more Polish atrocities. These were again repeated last night. Recently, in one night, there were as many as 21 frontier incidents. Last night, there were 14, of which 3 were quite serious. I have therefore resolved to speak to Poland in the same language that Poland for months past has used towards us. This night, for the first time, Polish regular soldiers fired on our own territory. Since 5:45 a.m. we have been returning the fire. I will continue this struggle, no matter against whom, until the safety of the Reich and its rights are secured." As Hitler spoke these words, the combined might of the German Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe was already storming across the border into Poland. While the Allied powers were not fooled for long, the confusion sown by the Operation Himmler attacks bought Hitler valuable time to complete his invasion unopposed. On September the 17th, the Soviet Union, with whom Hitler had signed a non-aggression pact, invaded Poland from the east. By October the 6th, Poland's fate was sealed and the stage was set for the most destructive conflict in modern history.